Historical myths that turned out to be true. Viking soul swords. Despite what movies and video games may lead you to believe, we all know that defeating your enemies with a sword will not inherently make your sword stronger. Or will it? Hey, bro sauce, Brody here, and in today's video, we're discussing soul swords. Okay, fake beard and glasses aside, let's discuss what's going on here. For starters, the term soul swords is not historic or scientific. It's just a word I'm using to describe the phenomenon at play. Regardless, back in the early Iron Age in Scandinavia, right before the age of the Vikings, Scandinavian warriors had one big issue. Their weapons sucked. Specifically, the iron ones. And the biggest reason for that was because during this early iron era, a majority of the iron collected by the Scandinavians was bog iron. Bog iron is formed by bacteria in bogs that is oxidizing trace amounts of iron to gain energy. And in doing so, it would naturally concentrate the iron. And this concentration would actually allow it to be collected and then later smithed. Now, for me, this is super interesting because I had no idea that there was an organic way of farming iron without mining it. But for the Scandinavians, it wasn't so interesting or even beneficial. And that's because while bog iron was convenient, it was not strong. Bog iron, unsurprisingly, is very impure, and for that reason, soft when forged, meaning that the Scandinavians definitely had a disadvantage in battle. And the Scandinavians definitely weren't strangers to battle, but that's a different story. Now, the Scandinavians knew that there was a serious issue with their metal, but they didn't have a solution until they realized that they were not using one of their most plentiful resources, the body of their enemies. And that's not a joke. Scandinavian blacksmiths theorized that potentially incorporating the bones of their dead enemies, or any dead person for that matter, could potentially transfer the spirit of that dead individual into that blade, causing it to be stronger and more durable. And this is where things get a bit interesting, because during this Scandinavian Viking time, they very much so believed that this process was in fact strengthening their swords. However, as history went on, there was a large gap of time between then and now where people simply believed that this was more of a folktale or potentially symbolic, and not really any true benefit to the sword. But interestingly, in recent years, it was actually discovered that no, the Vikings were onto something, although not in the way that they intended. You see, while the Scandinavians and Vikings were using the bones of their enemies, ancestors, and animals to spiritually fuse them to their swords to increase its power, in reality, what they were doing was actually creating a rudimentary form of steel. And the reason for this is because the bones that they were using contained carbon. Like all organic matter, carbon is present, and bones are no exception for that rule, which is why when bones were introduced into the forging process of these swords and weapons, the bog iron was literally being turned into an organic alloy due to this introduction of bones, which in a morbid way is kind of badass. But yeah, I wanted to put this entry first because I thought the timeline was so funny. The Scandinavians and Vikings had a very spiritual connection to their weapons, and for that reason, they literally wanted to infuse spirits and souls into them to increase their power. And while to them it was the souls that were adding the power, in reality it was the bones. But what's even more interesting is that down the line, when this practice was theorized and discovered, it was believed by historians and scientists that this was more or less symbolic and spiritual and had no real-world utility. And for that reason, the myth of these bones making the sword stronger was, well, a myth. That was until those same people took a closer look at the swords and realized that, wait, there's not a soul in this sword, but there is early steel. Like, I can only imagine being a scientist or historian in that room, looking at the sword and being like, oh, that's cute, look at them. They put bones on it because they thought it would be like, you know, soul bound or something. That's funny. Oh my God, they made steel. And the myth of this bone forging process being beneficial was quickly realized to be fact, albeit in a roundabout way. But we're just getting started, so let's move on. Gladiator versus lion. There's honestly so much cool stuff to discuss when you're talking about gladiators. But when it comes to historical myths, one of the most prevalent was the fact, or myth, that they never actually fought animals. The whole gladiatorial games is a rabbit hole in itself, simply because there was so much variety in the types of games that were happening, some more unfair than others, and some didn't even involve gladiators in the first place. For example, in the Roman Colosseum, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for criminals to be subject not to death, but to a fight in the Colosseum against another criminal to the death, meaning that while it wasn't a death sentence, there was a likely chance that you would die. On top of this ancient version of bum fights, there was also literal naval battles that would take place in the Colosseum. Yeah, they would literally flood the place and have boats in there, which is just badass. And in other cases, they would have a criminal not fight another criminal, but fight a professional gladiator, which in that case was definitely a death sentence. And as we all know, gladiators also fought gladiators. But as some of you might not know, gladiators didn't always fight to the death. And it's been proven historically that professional gladiators were of high value to their investors. And while the fights were brutal, typically gladiatorial battles only had a 10 to 20% fatality rate, which is still insane, but that statistic is more like the now modern day knockout rate in the UFC, likely the modern day equivalent of the Roman Colosseum. Now, this is where things take a turn, because while all of the different types of battles that happened to the Colosseum were historically provable through artifacts and records, there was one sort of battle that was not proven until recently, and that was battles of gladiators fighting tigers. Now, this is interesting because there has long been records and specifically artworks found of gladiators depicted fighting big cats, specifically lions or tigers. But interestingly, there was never any historical evidence found of these matches actually happening. Which is why, for that reason, it was theorized that these artworks were more or less symbolic, showing the strength and the fearlessness of these gladiators, rather than them actually fighting lions and tigers, because, well, how would you even do that in the first place? But when you remember that you're discussing people that literally fit boats into the Colosseum, it's not hard to imagine they would find a way to get tigers involved as well. Although, I guess that thought wasn't in the mind of historians and archaeologists at the time, because while I'm sure they thought it was possible, they had no evidence to back up this claim. That was until recently. And when I say recently, I mean recently. The first article published proving the existence of human bones with animal bite marks in the Colosseum was published in 2025. Although in this article, it is stated that these bones were collected in the early 2000s. Unsurprisingly, the publishing of this article was significant because for the first time ever, we had genuine proof of animals fighting gladiators in the Colosseum, which is kind of surprising considering how much art there was depicting it. But I guess if this was so rare and so special back then, it's not hard to imagine why there would be so much art about it because, well, it was significant. Just think about it in a modern context. Nobody takes pictures of regular stuff. You only take pictures of important or significant things. Regardless, yeah, for the longest time, it was believed that while gladiators and the whole gladiatorial games in the Colosseum were interesting and, well, diverse, up until very recently, there was no proof that they were fighting lions or any big animals. That was until last year when it was proven, because they found a skeleton of a likely 20-year-old man with a tooth mark in his skull and pelvis. And this tooth mark, according to archaeologists, is unmistakably the tooth mark of either a tiger or a lion. Once again, making a historic myth actually fact. The mythical gorilla. If I were to describe a mythical creature to you that was tall, hairy, muscular, and had big teeth, what would you assume I was talking about? Maybe Bigfoot? Maybe Sasquatch? Maybe even a woolly mammoth? But what if I were to tell you that the mythical creature I was describing was actually a gorilla? That's right. Up until surprisingly recently, the concept of a gorilla in the Western world was not something of fact, and it was believed that stories of gorillas were folktales, describing some sort of mythical creature. And while gorillas are definitely mythical in their own regard, they themselves also prove that sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Let me explain. Now, it's important to note that gorillas obviously were known to people who lived around them. Anybody who lived in the area where gorillas were native were not shocked by them existing. They were simply a creature in their habitat. They were neighbors, essentially. Although, in the Western world, gorillas were something that could not even be fathomed, which is once again why they were presumed to be mythical rather than potentially something unseen. One of the earliest recorded accounts of somebody from the Western world describing a gorilla come from an English traveler named Andrew Battle. He lived from 1565 to 1614, and his story is, well, interesting to say the least, but that's a topic for another video. During his travels, Andrew ran into a rather interesting creature that he called Pongo. And the mention of this Pongo creature is, as I stated, one of the first ever recorded mentions of the existence of the gorilla. This is an actual quote from Andrew Battle describing the Pongo creature. This Pongo is in all proportion like a man, but he is more like a giant in stature than a man, for he is tall, and hath a man's face, hollowed eyes, and long hair upon his brows. His face and ears are without hair, and his hands also. His body is full of hair, but not thick, and it is a Danish color. He goeth a ways upon his legs, and carries his hands clasped on the nape of the neck. When he goeth upon the ground, they go many together, and kill many that trail in the woods. Those Pongo are never taken alive, because they are so strong, that 10 men cannot hold one of them. That description, albeit long, is interesting and relatively detailed, and coming from a, well, potentially reputable source, it's interesting that even this was written off. Although with no point of reference and this guy literally being held in captivity in Africa, it's potentially reasonable to assume he either hallucinated something or saw something he really didn't, or, well, who knows? Regardless, this account from the early 1600s was the first and really last for a very long time. Which brings us all the way to the 1800s. That's right, over 200 years of gorillas being, well, misunderstood and assumed to be mythology. That was until physician and naturalist Thomas Savage obtained several gorilla bones, including skulls. And with these new discoveries, he wrote his first formal description of this newly discovered animal known as a gorilla. Now, Thomas Savage was actually a wealthy physician from America. He went to Yale Medical School and received his degree in 1833. And interestingly, in 1836, he even became a priest as well. So this man was busy. And because this man was both a priest and a doctor, he was sent as a medical missionary to Africa, specifically Liberia. And it was during his time in Liberia where he was able to acquire the skull and bones of the species that at the time was unknown. That was until he gave it the name that is, well, now famous. Now, the story doesn't end there because we still don't know everything about it, and there is still no, well, visitation of gorillas from experts. Although I do use that term a bit lightly. Introducing Paul de Chaillu, and he was a French-American traveler and zoologist. And he is famous for being the first Westerner to confirm the existence of gorillas. Paul, similar to Thomas, spent time in Africa, although Paul spent time in Africa slightly after Thomas, and what he did was vastly different. Because Paul was not collecting bones in Africa, he was actively killing and sending gorilla bodies back to Europe, and was also actively trying to capture baby gorillas, although unsuccessfully. Paul wasn't doing this out of the goodness for his heart, however, and he was actively selling gorilla bodies to the Natural History Museum in London, where all world artifacts seem to end up, apparently. And as I mentioned, he actively tried to capture many baby infant gorillas, but said that they were too, quote, ill-tempered and they all died within his captivity. On top of this, Paul also sold cannibal skulls found from native tribes in Africa to Europeans as well, which seems less about science and more about money, but that's beyond the point. Regardless, it wasn't until the 1860s that it was proven as a fact that gorillas were actual creatures and not mythical creatures just made up by African tribes. Which is a bit ironic considering they literally had European travelers who described seeing these creatures as well, but, well, we'll ignore that. But yeah, up until the 1860s, most Europeans likely have never even heard of a gorilla. And if they did, they assumed it was just some sort of outlandish creature. That was until somebody decided to go, kill them, and send them home for money. But at least with that, we did have the European discovery of the gorilla, proving this myth to be fact. But in case that wasn't interesting enough, check this out. At least in a European context, the discovery of dinosaurs just slightly predates the discovery of gorillas, which if you think about it is insane. Because how do you discover something that lived millions of years before your time, before you discover something that is actively walking the earth and you are actively being told about from native tribes in Africa? Now that I think about it, this entire section kind of makes me feel like European travelers didn't really respect the locals. But what do I know? The golden sheepskin. Greek mythology undoubtedly has some of the coolest imagery and lore when it comes to, well, mythology. However, not all of this mythology is all myth, and some of it actually has genuine roots in history. One notable story from Greek mythology describes something known as the Golden Fleece. It is a legendary artifact that essentially came from a divine flying golden ram, and this ram was essentially a symbol of divine favor and kingship. Now, within the story of the Golden Fleece, there is a man named Jason. He was on a quest to claim his rightful throne, and in this pursuit, he made it his mission to retrieve this Golden Fleece of this mythic, mysterious, and, well, divine ram. And long story short, not to spoil it, but he slays the impossible to slay dragon and retrieves the Golden Fleece. The story is obviously more detailed than that, but I'm just giving a trust me bro summary. Now, let's separate fact from fiction. In the story, Jason travels to a city called Colchis, which is in modern-day Georgia, which is a relevant fact. And while Jason may have never existed, and while the whole golden ram may have also never existed, and I can pretty confidently say there probably wasn't a dragon around either, there is one thing that is very likely a real artifact, that being the Golden Fleece. And the reason I say this is because in Georgia specifically, the location where the story took place, it is not uncommon for gold deposits to wash downstream from mountains in certain waterways. But of course, that's not all. On top of gold literally just washing down the river, there is evidence to suggest that farmers at the time who lived in these regions would use sheepskins from their animals to collect these gold nuggets heading downstream, doing essentially an early version of gold prospecting. But this is where things get interesting, because although people are still doing this in modern-day Georgia, it is believed that this tradition has been passed down through thousands of years, meaning that it is more likely than not that during the time of the story of the Great Fleece, people were using sheepskins to collect gold, literally creating their own golden fleece, leading some historians and experts to believe that this practice and this artifact wasn't just pure myth and actually had a strong basis in, well, reality. And while this artifact alone may be the only piece of fact from the mythology, it's still interesting to see that even some of the largest mythological stories still have a kernel of truth. And it's also cool to kind of imagine the first person who saw, a sheep pelt drying out with some gold on it to be so inspired that they write some crazy lore around it. This is kind of the equivalent of somebody just seeing a stick poking out of the ground and then writing Star Wars. The Puakai. If you thought the United States had the biggest, strongest, and freest eagles, you would be sorely mistaken, because New Zealand actually takes that record. The Puakai is a mythological creature, and it's referred to as a monstrous bird in Maori mythology. The Maori people are believed to be some of the first people to have ever settled in New Zealand, and their history in New Zealand is vast and runs deep. And an interesting part of their story in New Zealand is their mythology, specifically the Puakai. You see, in Maori mythology, the Puakai is a bird that is so massive and so strong that it could pick up and kill a man with ease. And for that reason, this was a mythological creature that was terrifying, and definitely not something to mess with. It was typically seen or used as a cautionary tale, but also sometimes as a symbol of strength. It is believed that the Maori people arrived in New Zealand sometime around the 1400s. And from the 1400s to the mid-1700s, the Maori people remained uncontacted in New Zealand, until they gained contact with European travelers in the late 1700s. Prior to the Maori's contact with the Europeans, they did not have a formal writing system, which means that they relied on oral storytelling to have some sort of record of their people's history, which is a big reason why they had so much lore and such cool stories. But obviously, when a majority of your historical records come from oral accounts, you're basically playing a big game of telephone, and it's hard to tell fact from fiction. And such is the case with the Puakai, because for many, the existence of the Puakai seems, well, too crazy to be true, not only to the Europeans, but also to younger Maori generations. Regardless, that didn't stop the Maori people from continuing the traditions and telling the story of the Puakai. But that doesn't mean that they never existed. Enter the Haast eagle. You see, the Haast eagle is an extinct species of eagle that lived specifically in New Zealand at the exact same place where the Maori people lived. Interestingly as well, the Haast eagle is also the largest known eagle to have ever existed, and it's believed that they weighed anywhere from 22 to 40 pounds and preyed almost exclusively on a bird named moa, which is essentially just an extinct 500-pound variant of the modern-day ostrich. It's believed by researchers that the Haast eagle got to the size it did because it had no natural predators and had seemingly an endless amount of prey, allowing it to evolve and grow uninterrupted. That was until some people came to the island of New Zealand, specifically the Maori people. You see, it's believed that the Haast eagle officially went extinct in 1445, and experts say they went extinct because after the Maori people reached the island of New Zealand only years prior, they were able to hunt the Mau bird to extinction. And with the Mau birds being the primary prey of the Haast eagle, it's not hard to understand how the Haast eagle went extinct after its entire food supply was shut off. And this is really where things get interesting, because if you remember, the Puakai, as described by the Maori people, is a large, monstrous bird that could easily pick up and kill a human man. And as we know, the Haast eagle lived in the same place as the Maori people for a short amount of time, as well as the fact that the Haast eagle also preyed on animals that were literally 500 pounds, meaning that if they could take on that flightless bird, they could probably take on a human, or at least a child at that. And considering the fact that the Maori people were literally devastating the Haast eagle's food supply, it's not hard to imagine that the Haast eagles could either be desperate or just straight up mad that these newfound humans in their ecosystem are messing everything up, potentially triggering some Haast eagle attacks, or Puakai attacks. And while for hundreds of years the story of the Puakai may have seemed like mythology to the Maori people and the Europeans they encountered, when the existence of the Haast eagle was discovered in 1871, the dots were slowly connected, and it was eventually revealed that the Puakai was not any sort of mythical creature. It was very much so real, but unfortunately never lived long enough to tell its side of the story. Speaking of telling stories, if you like the way I tell stories and want to see more cool stories every single Friday, feel free to be a bro and subscribe to the channel. We're currently on the road to 2 million subscribers, and like I said, we post cool videos every single Friday. And I guess while I'm chilling, if you're enjoying this video about myths that actually turned out to be true and want to see a part 2, all you need to do is either leave a like on this video or comment part 2 so I know that you guys actually want more of this. But now that you're subscribed and have liked the video, let's move on to the final entry on this list. Ancient ozone. I would assume, or at least hope, that everybody watching this video now is familiar with the ozone layer. You know, the protective layer that is literally protecting everybody watching this video right now from the harmful radiation of the sun and space. And while the ozone layer is definitely the GOAT of protecting us from harmful space rays, it actually existed in mythology far before it existed in the scientific world. You see, the ozone layer was officially discovered in 1913 by French physicists Charles Fabry and Henry Boysen, and that discovery was significant. But what if I told you that not just 100 years ago, but thousands of years ago, the concept of an ozone layer was already theorized and well established in the world of mythology? Let me explain. Norse mythology, like Greek mythology, like Scandinavian mythology, runs deep. But one interesting part of Norse mythology I wanted to focus in on is known as Svalin. And in Norse mythology, Svalin is literally a legendary shield that stands in front of the earth and the sun, and its sole purpose is to protect the world from overheating. It's believed that the myth of Svalin dates back all the way to the Bronze Age. And interestingly, the word Svalin itself is actually a translation for the word cold or chill, meaning that Svalin was literally a chill guy. Jokes aside, there's not much known about where this mythology actually stemmed from, although it's interesting how, well, accurate it actually was. Now, whether or not this Nordic mythology from the Bronze Age was actually onto something, or it was just, well, sheer coincidence, the similarities are glaring, which is why I wanted to add it for that reason. Because obviously the definition of Svalin is strictly mythical, the concept of what Svalin represents is definitely not myth and very much so reality. And while it took until 1913 for physicists to discover the ozone layer, for Nordic storytellers, they were able to theorize the ozone layer with no proof before they ever even discovered iron. That's pretty cool. Ancient traditions we still do for no reason. You and your best bro are sitting at a train station waiting on a bench for your train to come. You both have been so excited about the trip you're about to embark on, and you both are surprisingly feeling rather inquisitive today. And it's that inquisitiveness that's actually going to make today's journey rather insightful. As you both are beginning to get bored, you realize that you do have some time to kill before the train will arrive, and you decide to stroll around the city center while you wait. Almost immediately upon exiting the train station, you notice a beautiful fountain. This fountain is massive, historic, and has multiple water features, just making it look so cool. And interestingly, as you approach it, you notice that the entire bottom of this well is filled with coins, and you actively see people throwing coins into this well as you are looking at it. Obviously, not wanting to miss out on some good fortune, you decide to throw a coin of your own. And it's almost instantly after this coin leaves your hand that you begin to question, wait, why am I even doing this? Surely there's an explanation for people throwing currency into water features. However, luckily for you, your friend has a book on ancient traditions. And this book, admittedly, is going to do some heavy lifting today. And as your friend opens this book to tell you the answer to your question, he finds the specific page, and it's really quite interesting. You see, the tradition of tossing coins into a fountain doesn't date back 10 years or 100 years, it dates back thousands of years. And the reason why we do it is literally an ancient belief that, well, just kind of stuck. The most commonly agreed upon explanation of this tradition actually dates back to Roman, British, and Celtic mythology. And the part of that mythology that most pertains to this, well, tradition is the fact that if you were out in the wild and happened to stumble upon some sort of fresh water source such as a spring or creek or lake, you were literally blessed by a water deity who had just granted you good fortune and good health in the form of random clean drinking water. Now, obviously, because you have been given such a massive and random gift by the water deities, the only natural thing to do in return is, of course, repay them, which is where the monetary offering comes into place. It was commonplace at this time to literally leave money or gold in fresh water sources to repay nature and thank it for its offering, which is partially wholesome because it's such a deep gratitude for nature, but also kind of ironic because you're finding a clean water source and then instantly contaminating it, at least if you're using, well, dirty coins, specifically ones stored in your prison wallet. Regardless, while this tradition is obviously interesting, there are other similar practices that actually predate coinage altogether. And many much older cultures that had similar beliefs about water deities would leave offerings such as food, special stones, carved artifacts, and even herbs in exchange and in gratitude of natural water sources that they also found. Now, interestingly, as time went on and beliefs changed and the religions evolved, the tradition itself stayed the same. However, the reasoning behind it simply took on a new meaning. During the Roman era, for example, travelers would typically throw coins into fountains right before a journey, using it as an offering for safe passage or success on their trip. And while that specific belief still definitely exists on the modern day, I would argue that for the most part, people that are throwing coins into wells in the big 2026 are usually just doing so for a bit of fun and potentially some good luck as well. And while in the modern day this tradition may seem like it's all fun and games, there was a time not too long ago where this tradition literally seemed like life or death. After getting this insightful history lesson from your bro, you now feel both informed and positive because you have just unintentionally blessed the journey you and your friend were about to go on. And while the explanation that your friend had just given you was interesting, it was also lengthy, and the train was about to arrive any moment. As you and your friend rush to get onto your train, you sit down in your seats and begin to relax, thinking about the fun day you have ahead of you once you arrive in your location. But because you know you're stuck on this train for at least the next few hours, you decide to take out your laptop and get some work done. When of course, your mind notices another outdated tradition. As you open your laptop and wait for it to turn on, you look down at your keyboard and ask yourself, wait, why is every single keyboard laid out this way? Like, who decided to put A, S, D, F beside each other? And what the heck is a QWERTY? Wouldn't it just make more sense if the keyboard was A to Z? And while you continue to ponder this on your own, your friend is already flipping to the right page in the history book to see the ancient origin of this strange tradition. And he explains that the reason why keyboards are laid out the way they are date back all the way to the 1870s, which obviously isn't ancient, but I figured it was old enough to put on this list. In the 1870s, obviously, people were not creating keyboard layouts for computers. They were creating layouts for mechanical typewriters. And interestingly and intuitively, early typewriter prototypes actually had the alphabet laid out in A to Z formatting. But very quickly, people were running into one major issue. Letters that were commonly used consecutively would get stuck together on the typewriter. And with a keyboard that goes from A to Z, some common combinations were, of course, EF, AB, ST, NO, and DE. And because of all of these common letter combinations being right beside each other in the keyboard, as I mentioned, A, they were getting stuck together, and B, the arms of the mechanical typewriter were actually striking each other, essentially jamming the machine, making it either temporarily inoperable or, in some better cases, just damaging it slightly. Regardless, they learned pretty quickly that A to Z was not sustainable for early keyboards, which is why they needed to make a new mechanical keyboard layout, and this job was completed by Christopher Scholes. Christopher's solution to this issue was to separate letters that were commonly used pairs to intentionally slow down typists and reduce the overlap in letters being used consecutively. That alone is kind of hilarious because in the 1870s, typists had to be nerfed because typists were literally so good and fast at typing that they were breaking the machines. Imagine how annoying that would be, being so good at typing that you were typing so fast the machine would break that you then had to replace that machine with a completely new layout. Like, I personally got a new Razer keyboard that has a whole new 6 buttons at the very left side of the keyboard, and that messed me up for weeks because every time I wanted to hit escape, I was actually hitting M6, and every time I thought I was hitting S, I was hitting A. Regardless, that small change was annoying, and I couldn't imagine experiencing an entirely new keyboard layout. And it's actually, ironically, this reason alone that we still use the QWERTY keyboard layout to this very day. Obviously, modern-day keyboards and computers have no issues with keys getting stuck or mechanical arms striking each other. And theoretically speaking, we could totally switch over to a number of different layouts, and there are actually other ones that do exist. However, the reason why the QWERTY layout is still the standard of the world to this very day, and likely will be forever, is simply because once it was established as the industry standard for typewriters, the format, the scale set, and the habit all sort of transitioned into other technological devices. And at this point now, even though the reasoning for this layout is completely redundant, it would be way more trouble than it's worth to try to introduce a new layout, even though it's, well, kind of obsolete at this point. So yeah, even though over 100 years ago, there was a very good reason to be using the QWERTY layout on a keyboard, in the modern day, the reason why we still use this format is more so tradition than efficiency. As your friend begins to close the history book after telling you all of this interesting information, you see a plume of dust blow out of the book as he slams it shut. And of course, the first thing your friend does is sneeze, the body's natural reaction to, well, pollutants in the nostrils. And while your friend sneezes aggressively on this train, you respond to his sneeze without even thinking about it. And you tell him, bless you. But before your friend could even wipe off the snot he launched on the seat back in front of him, you ask him to open the book again, because you're curious why we even say bless you in the first place. Obviously, this has to have some sort of ancient origin, and you need to get to the bottom of it. And luckily for you, your friend obliges, and he explains the following. The tradition of saying bless you after somebody sneezes is one of the oldest recorded traditions that exists from ancient times that is still extremely prevalent in the modern day. And I would argue that most of the people that say bless you do it to be kind and polite. However, they have no idea what the origin of what they're saying even means. But don't worry, you're watching Trust Me Bro, and you're gonna learn. Some people claim that the origin of saying bless you after somebody sneezes dates back to the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, who were believed to have seen sneezing as a divine sign. In some cases as a good sign, but in most cases a bad sign. And this bad sign was typically interpreted as your soul literally leaving your body, or as you being attacked by some sort of unseen demon. In the case of your soul leaving your body, it was believed that during a sneeze, your soul would at least temporarily leave your body, and for that reason, it was vulnerable to be taken by Satan, which is why anybody with an earshot who had heard your sneeze would bless you to protect your soul from being stolen by the devil. And in the case of being attacked by a demon, some believed that sneezing was a form of you removing evil spirits from your body. And in this case, bystanders would say bless you simply to help you further remove these evil spirits. I don't know about you, but both of these to me are extremely interesting because something that is now seen as a polite thing to say was literally a casual form of exorcism in ancient times. In any instance, people would say bless you literally as a form of blessing you or protecting you from this divine or supernatural experience that could potentially be negative. And even if it were positive, they were simply affirming your positive divine experience. Besides the Roman and Greek origins of the phrase, there's also another origin that dates back all the way to medieval Europe, specifically around the bubonic plague. During the bubonic plague, one of the earliest warning signs, at least that was believed at the time, was sneezing. And it was for this reason that anytime somebody heard somebody sneezing, they would offer them a blessing, as they knew that the next time they would see this person, they likely wouldn't be alive. Regardless of which origin you subscribe to, the fact that we still do this in the modern day, to me at least, is interesting. Because I would argue that basically nobody in the modern day are helping people expel demons or wishing them a safe passage to the afterlife when they say bless you after hearing a sneeze. And while the tradition is still popular in the modern day, it really has no practical purpose besides being polite. But I do think the history is interesting and, well, there's nothing wrong with being polite, so while there's no reason for this tradition, I don't mind it being around. Oh, and if you're curious about the meaning behind Gesundheit, you know, those weirdos that say Gesundheit after you sneeze, well, that actually stems from the German language, because the word Gesundheit is actually somewhat borrowing the German words for health or good health. And this tradition is actually more so modern, taking place in the 20th century. And while it doesn't have the divine roots, it does have the same core message of wishing you good health. But yeah, I honestly don't know who says Gesundheit. If you do, comment below and unsubscribe. As your friend begins to close the book, for a second time, another plume of dust shoots up his nose and he sneezes once again, further covering the seat back in front of him with his green goo. And because of this, you both go silent, trying to figure out how you're gonna clean up all this snot. But in your silence and pondering, you hear the people in front of you speaking. And fortunately, they're not speaking about your snot. They're speaking about natural disasters of all things. You decide to listen in. And one thing you notice is that every hurricane they mention has a name. And while in the modern day this is commonplace, your inquisitive mind can't help but ask, what is the ancient origin of naming storms after people, specifically women, for a very long time? And while you don't say this out loud, the inquisitive look on your face and you slowly pointing at the book is enough of a hint for your friend to open the book and find the ancient origin of the tradition of naming storms. And while he is still in no condition to read, he leans the book towards you and it reads the following. The tradition of naming storms dates all the way back to the 1800s. And while it once again isn't ancient, I think it's old enough. Regardless, during the 1800s, specifically in countries and islands that saw a ton of hurricane activity, decided to start naming these tropical storms after saints, specifically saints that had days dedicated to them. And how they would associate these names to these storms is whichever saint's day was closest to the day of the storm would have their name given to the storm as well. So for example, on July 26, 1925, the hurricane was called Hurricane Santa Ana, and so on and so forth. But while this tradition was happening in smaller island nations, it wasn't commonplace globally yet. And in most places of the world that didn't see tropical storms very often, how they would identify storms is simply by addressing them by the longitude and latitude that they were currently at. Now, the only problem with this was that A, it was kind of confusing for regular people because most people are not familiar with the longitude or latitude they live at, and also if somebody was trying to track multiple storms, it would be a plethora of numbers they would have to memorize and try to decipher rather than just remembering a name, something most people are pretty good with already. In the early 1900s, the tradition of giving storms non-numerical names started to gain popularity, although these names were always retrospective, specifically naming storms after locations that they destroyed. Although giving a storm a name after the fact doesn't help save any lives. And it was for this reason that in the 1950s in the United States, meteorologists began giving storms names in alphabetical order. However, these names were not human names, they were military names, such as Bravo, Echo, words like that. Although that naming structure actually only existed for 3 years, until in 1953 when meteorologists officially began naming hurricanes after women. That's right, they began using human names, but only female human names, of course going in alphabetical order. Now, if you have a keen eye, you would notice that, well, in the modern day, storms are named after men, and I'm curious if you know, what year did they begin naming storms after men as well? If you said 1979, you'd be right, which means that for 26 years, storms were named exclusively after women, which to me just seems illogical, and I'm curious if they added men's names to be fair, or just because they were running out of names. Regardless, the sexism in that is an entirely different ancient tradition that we're not discussing in this video. With the introductions of human names, there has also been an introduction of retiring names if the storm was catastrophic enough, meaning that there are some human names that storms will never have again, like Katrina, for example. But yeah, the tradition of naming storms isn't necessarily ancient, although it has a very interesting history in my opinion. And while naming storms after the longitude and latitude in my opinion is way too overcomplicated, I feel like giving them human names is almost a bit too simple as well. And I feel like there's possibly a middle ground of names that sound scientific but are also easy to understand and communicate. Like, for example, like some sort of code. Like, look at German cars. C63 AMG, M340i, not a real M car, A8, Porsche 911 GTS. All relatively simple and scientific sounding naming structures that aren't, well, giving storms human personas. This kind of reminds me of the media giving like serial killers unintentionally really cool names. Like, it's not helping anything. And I feel like if you're a kid in school and let's say that Hurricane Luke is coming to town, if you're a kid in school and your name is Luke, you are gonna get picked on for the next while. And every time there's an update in the news, everybody's saying, oh, Luke's coming to town, look what Luke did. And as a kid, that's probably gonna be pretty annoying. Regardless, you've now got to the bottom of another outdated tradition. As you and your friend complete reading the section of the book, your friend closes the book and you both sit and reflect. And you really can't help yourself but say, wow, I truly am grateful to live in a place that doesn't have hurricanes. Sure, we might have snow and high taxes, but I mean, no hurricanes is a big plus. And while your friend is agreeing with you, he actually remembers that he has an upcoming trip to Florida. And because of this, he says, hopefully a hurricane doesn't hit when I'm in Florida next month. And immediately after he says that, he knocks on the closest piece of wood he can find, obviously ensuring that he didn't just bring negativity onto his trip. But almost instantly after knocking on the wood, your friend sees the look in your eyes and knows that you're inquisitive on why do people knock on wood after they say something that could be unfortunate. And before you can say anything, he's already opening the book, looking for an explanation. And what he reveals is the following. Interestingly, people knocking on wood is extremely similar to people throwing coins into natural springs. In both of these instances, individuals are believing that they are interacting with spirits and actively bringing good fortune and blessings onto themselves. However, the way that knocking on wood works is just a bit different. The origin of the wood knocking tradition is believed to date back to Celtic or German folklore, and it's believed within this folklore that benevolent, supernatural beings live in trees. You know, fairies, sprites, and just general positive spirits. It was because of this belief that fortunate and positive spirits were living in trees that people began to form the tradition of touching trees or knocking on trees specifically to wake up the spirits and request good luck from them. This touching or knocking could also be a sign of gratitude, thanking them for good fortune that you've experienced, which of course rings similar to the first section where people would put an offering into a natural spring to show gratitude or to request good fortune. Now, interestingly, the belief that trees are sacred or full of positive spirits isn't necessarily exclusive to German or Celtic mythology, and this belief has actually existed throughout almost all of time in basically every culture. Trees, in my opinion, are really cool, and almost every ancient and modern culture has recognized that in one way or another. And knocking on wood is simply one example of that has, I guess, evolved and transformed over time. And while most people who still knock on wood for good luck don't necessarily know why they're doing it, and they're definitely not praying to spirits within the wood, they are displaying a bit of belief and a bit of superstition, which go to show the strength of beliefs and the importance of traditions within history. So yeah, even though knocking on wood just seems like a funny thing to do so you don't jinx yourself, the ancient origins of this tradition are a lot less silly and a lot more serious. And they might make you look at trees just a little bit differently. But with all of the talking that you and your friend have been doing, day has turned to night on this train ride, and you see one of the train employees approaching you with the beverage cart. You and your friend both take an adult beverage, and before either of you dare take a sip from your glasses, you delicately touch the two glasses together and then proceed to drink. Luckily, at this point in the train ride, your friend already knows the drill, and fortunately, this time he doesn't even need to consult the book, because he knows why we do this. And after he takes a firm gulp of his drink, he tells you the following. There's actually a few really interesting reasons why people would cheers their drink. One of the most popular explanations why people would clink their glasses or cheers in ancient times is because they wanted to make sure that their drink was not poisoned. It's believed that people would cheers their drinks with so much force that the liquid would literally spill out of the cups and kind of just, cross-contaminate drinks with each other. But this was strategic to ensure that if your drink was poisoned and your guest witnessed your drink go into their drink, if they were hesitant to have their drink, then you could kind of know your drink was poisoned. This was definitely some ancient 5D chess. Although with poisonings being rather common in ancient times, this isn't necessarily an unbelievable explanation and does make sense. Although it isn't the only reason why people would cheers in previous times. And another common reason why people would cheers glasses in ancient times is to ward off evil spirits. It was believed by some cultures that the loud noise of the glasses hitting each other were loud enough to scare away evil spirits. And this practice was kind of linked to church bells as well, which I think also makes sense. But regardless, obviously this tradition of warding off evil spirits and sharing poison still exists, but its meaning is completely different. And in the modern day, people cheers simply to show a sign of unity and respect. Although, if you ever believe your drink is poisoned, well, just make sure you cheers really hard. But considering most of the glasses that people use today are bought from Temu, well, if you try doing an aggressive cheers, you're just gonna spill drink on the table and have glass shards in your hand. So instead, if you really want to protect yourself from poison and express some unity and good cheer, subscribe to the channel. We currently have over 1.1 million bros, and we're on the road to 2 million bros. And we have a strict no poisoning policy here, meaning that you're safe to subscribe and enjoy great videos every single Friday, just like this. And if you want more videos like this one, leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2 so that I know you want more videos about ancient traditions that we still do today. And with this, let's continue to the final few traditions of this video. As you and your friend are finishing your drinks and beginning to relax, you notice the train employee coming back to collect your glasses. But you realize they're not empty-handed. They're actually holding a birthday cake. Now, obviously, you're shocked because it's not your birthday whatsoever, although your friend has a look in his face that he told the train it was your birthday, A, to embarrass you, and B, to get a free cake. And after the train staff finish singing happy birthday, you two are both left with a cake and one candle on it. But before you can even blow out this candle, your inquisitive mind gets the best of you. And your friend, once again, refers to the book. And this one is mind-blowing. The tradition of putting candles on a cake and blowing them out actually dates back thousands of years to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks would bake round cakes in honor of Artemis, the goddess of the moon. But not only would they bake these cakes in honor of the moon, but they would place candles on top of the cake to replicate the moon's signature glow. Once again, further honoring the moon. After the ancient Greeks had created their own edible moon replica, they would then make wishes that they believed the smoke from the candles were lifting to the moon god in hopes that the moon god would answer their prayers and make their dreams come true. Over time, the tradition of baking cakes, putting candles on them, and allowing the smoke from the candles to rise was associated with different celebrations, and eventually became associated with birthdays. And from there, the tradition of allowing the candles to burn turned into blowing the candles out to further allow the smoke to rise and, of course, make your wish come true. And while in the modern day, I would imagine that basically nobody is trying to have their wishes granted by the moon god Artemis, the fact that this tradition still remains nearly untouched from its ancient traditional form, in my opinion, is at least very interesting and gives you a fun fact to share at every birthday party you go to. And it's kind of funny to just imagine somebody, praying to the moon god and offering them a cake, only for somebody to walk up and be like, oh, can we do this tomorrow? Tomorrow's my birthday, and we can pray together, and then we can eat the cake. Right. Like, it's just over time, people just took this opportunity of praying to gods and creating cakes as offerings to being like, actually, this is about me now. But yeah, that's why we blow out candles. Not because we all want to be amateur firefighters, but because thousands of years ago, people wanted the moon to grant their wishes. And while you and your friend complete this cake you received based off of lies, you feel tired and sluggish after the day of travel and the massive sugar intake. And for that reason, you decide to close your eyes and take a nap before your train gets to your destination. The craziest internet trends people actually did. We've all been there. It's late at night, you're on your phone, and you're scrolling and scrolling until you see a video on your feed that just boggles your mind. It's a video of a person doing the dumbest thing you can imagine. Then you quickly scroll away feeling truly embarrassed for that individual. But as you continue to scroll, you realize that that individual wasn't the only person doing that dumb thing. And as you continue to scroll and scroll, you notice that more and more people are seemingly all doing this incredibly stupid task. You have just stumbled upon a dumb internet trend. Whether it was on TikTok or YouTube or Facebook, the moral of the story is the same. Someone does something really dumb, it gets a lot of likes and views because people are laughing at you, not with you, and people who are hungry for views and attention begin to do the exact same thing in hopes that they could also reach internet fame. I'm not gonna act like I'm a saint here. I remember being a kid and doing the Harlem Shake, hoping to go viral and be a part of cool Harlem Shake compilations. But today's video is not about the Harlem Shake. It is about internet trends that were very obviously dangerous and in some cases even deadly. Oh, and as always, this video is only going to get crazier as the list goes on. Let's begin. The Outlet Challenge. Admittedly, this is going to be the most tame thing I talk about in this entire video, which is crazy because this first entry is literally wild. I don't know about you, but I was definitely a curious kid. And one of the things I was quite curious about is what would happen if I stuck something in the electrical outlet. Fortunately, I never acted on this curiosity. However, I know a lot of people watching this video likely did. With that being said, I do think there is a bit of a difference between doing it accidentally or not knowing what's going to happen and doing it intentionally knowing exactly what's going to happen. Which brings me to the Outlet Challenge. Starting in the early 2020s, videos started circulating on TikTok specifically of people performing a prank where they would plug their phone charger into a wall, tight enough so it would hold, but loose enough so there was a gap, and then they would drop a penny into that gap to see what would happen. The outcome of the seemingly simple machine was, well, a homemade bomb. And that's not an exaggeration. Nearly every video of people performing this challenge or trend resulted in a massive flash, typically resulting in an explosion and in some cases a fire. I wasn't able to track down the exact first instance of this challenge or trend taking place, but simply by searching Outlet Challenge, you can see that this trend was making waves specifically among schools in America. If you had nothing better to do, you could literally spend days watching TikToks of people at school plugging in phone chargers, dropping pennies, and causing explosions in the back of class, which unsurprisingly is dumb, but also dangerous. In the most tame examples of people performing this trend, the outcome would only be sparks and electrical shortage. However, in more extreme examples, full-blown electrical fires were started, smoke coming out of outlets, electrical outlets melting, and walls being covered in black tar, and classrooms needing to be evacuated. And I say classrooms specifically because nearly every video I watched about this challenge was once again at school. A place where kids felt like they could just, light off bombs and get away with it, I guess. Beyond the obvious stupidity of this challenge, there's truly not much more to say besides, I suppose, the danger or craziness aspect of it, which really isn't too crazy compared to some of the things we're going to discuss, but there is a very real opportunity for danger when performing this challenge, as a full-blown house fire is an extremely likely outcome if only a few sparks went in the wrong direction. Now, fortunately, that wasn't the case in most instances, but that doesn't mean that numerous students were at least suspended, expelled, or even charged for arson as a result of this completely dumb prank. Honestly, there's not too much more to say about it because it is extremely simple, and it's my opinion that the reason that this trend took off was because it was so easy to perform, and the result was a rather dramatic visual display. However, the ends don't justify the means here, because as I stated, intentionally shorting an electrical supply, specifically in a public place, is not only dangerous, but it's also illegal. And some kids that were dumb enough to try this challenge learned one or both of those lessons the hard way. Oh, and I guess as a little bit of a bonus for this first section, there was also a similar challenge going on around the same time that was known as the Chromebook Challenge. And all that this challenge involved was a school-provided Chromebook and a metal object. And how this challenge would be performed is you take your Chromebook, take your metal object, and put the metal object in the charge port of the Chromebook. And once again, similarly to the Outlet Challenge, the results were dramatic and in some cases outright dangerous. Videos online of people participating in this challenge show devices begin to spark, smoke, or in some cases even catch on fire. And these fires have reportedly melted charge ports, burnt desks, and generally done enough damage to the Chromebook itself and school property to charge students with property destruction, or in some cases, similar to the Outlet Challenge, arson. So yeah, like I said, this is one of the more tame challenges we're going to discuss, but it's no less brain dead. Because sure, making a fireball with a penny may seem cool, and it's definitely funny to see on a TikTok, but the reality of the situation after your 2 seconds of fame on TikTok ends is a much darker reality I hope none of you have experienced. Let's move on. The Door Kicking Challenge. In the first section, we talked about people intentionally doing damage to public property. However, in this section, the door kicking challenge turns it up a notch. Because in this very bright internet trend, what people do is intentionally damage private property, which not only comes with stricter repercussions, but also comes with a lot more danger, for reasons we'll get into. If you're watching this video and are a similar age to me, or probably any age, you likely at some point in your life have gone ding-dong ditching, or at least that's what we called it where I'm from. That pre-internet challenge consisted of going to somebody's house, knocking on the door, running away, hiding in a bush somewhere, and waiting for them to come outside for them to see, well, nobody at their door. And if you were extra crazy, you would do it once or twice more as well. And that was basically the extent of ding-dong ditching. Harmless, funny, but as an adult, I see how it is annoying. Although, Ring cameras, I think, have more or less destroyed this entire hobby, which might be a good thing. Now, the door kick challenge differs a bit from ding-dong ditching, because in this internet trend, you're not simply knocking on somebody's front door. What you're doing is you're filming yourself donkey kicking someone's front door and running away. The major difference between these two activities, if you couldn't already tell, is that a donkey kick, A, does a lot more damage, B, is a lot more threatening to anybody inside the house, and C, filming yourself doing this only adds to the case going to be built against you once charges are inevitably laid. I honestly have no idea when knocking on the door became not enough and having to literally kick the door became the new standard for ding-dong ditching, but the fact that people not only upped the ante and also filmed themselves, to me, is once again mind-boggling. However, when you're discussing internet or TikTok trends, you're not necessarily discussing the brightest bunch. And while this trend may seem extremely simple, the repercussions are definitely not. Because since this trend had gained popularity in the late 2010s and early 2020s, videos have of course gone viral online, and gullible children who partook in this challenge got in some serious hot water. As of today, several teenagers have already faced criminal charges for participating in this brainless prank. And some of the charges that have been placed on kids trying to be funny or go viral are the following: trespassing, vandalism, and even attempted burglary. Those charges alone are nothing to play with, but on top of the legal repercussions that kids have faced from doing this challenge, you also have to recognize the possible violent repercussions from homeowners. I'm not sure where you're watching this video from in the world, but I know there's at least a handful of you that are watching this that are saying, if this happened at my house, the first thing I'm doing is grabbing my gun. And because this trend was popular in the United States, that was the reality for a lot of homeowners. Now, part of this trend was after you kick the door, you leave. So fortunately, there wasn't many violent altercations taking place. However, if you were taking place in the door kicking challenge and happened to still be in the sightline of somebody who was armed and assuming that you were trying to break into their home, you may be leaving that property with more holes than you entered with. And I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but I'm saying that that's just a fact. If you go to somebody's property at night, donkey kick their door, in some case literally breaking the lock and opening it, I wouldn't say it's unfair for a homeowner to assume their house is being broken into. Just imagine how terrifying that can be. In my case, I actually can. Before I even knew this challenge was a thing, I literally had been more or less of the victim of this prank. I was at one of my friends' houses. We were having a big event for one of my friend's birthdays. The house was probably full with 20 people, and near the end of the night, we were all sitting in his living room when we heard a massive bang at the front door. It was late at night, this bang was not normal, it wasn't windy out, and we knew something was seriously wrong. Me and all my friends stood up, instantly were terrified but assumed a position, and the first thing we did was go and check out the front door. Fortunately, the door was locked, we unlock it, we open it, and nobody was there. But we noticed a massive footprint on the front door. My first thought was that somebody tried to kick down the door, failed, and ran off. But my friend who owned the home said that this was likely a kid trying to pull a prank and not to worry about it. And then he pulled up his Ring camera, saw the footage of the kid donkey kicking the door and running away, and well, we had a bit of a laugh about it, but we were all still rather irritated and on edge for the rest of the night. I think I've already given the door kicking challenge too much time as it is, because it is extremely simple and, well, I really don't need to explain how it's dumb and in some cases dangerous. But I will add a bit of a bonus as well, because similar to the door kicking challenge, there was also a similar trend that was going on, I feel like in 2023, 2024, known as the Kool-Aid Man challenge. In this challenge, you would typically run through somebody's fence, usually late at night, usually while drunk, and the sole goal was to break a hole in the fence and then move on with your day. For this trend, I didn't find too many examples of people filming themselves doing it. However, there is so many examples on security footage of people walking typically drunkenly down the sidewalk at night, seeing a fence, and then just deciding to run through it and continue on with their stroll. Unsurprisingly, this challenge, like the door kicking challenge, has also resulted in numerous charges being laid on teens and young adults thinking they're funny and getting a serious reality check. The Tide Pod Challenge. If you hadn't have heard of any of the other trends in this video so far, you've definitely heard of this one. And some of you may be thinking, the Tide Pod Challenge, that wasn't real, that was a joke. People didn't actually do that. And well, you're technically kind of right. The Tide Pod food meme definitely started with a satirical nature. People were posting pictures on Twitter and Reddit and other social medias of food with Tide Pods as a topping. Ironic and innocent enough. However, this joke quickly grew from fantasy to reality. Specifically, when people decided that, sure, a picture of it on a pizza is silly, but what if I actually tried to eat it? And this thought process and the eventual videos that came out of this thought process led to an internet trend that, well, unfortunately swept the nation. The Tide Pod challenge itself initially started circulating in the late 2010s, unsurprisingly among kids who had seen other viral videos and aspired to make their own viral videos, specifically of eating a Tide Pod. These videos weren't only exclusive to TikTok, they were kind of everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. They were being shared everywhere because of how ridiculous they were, and the whole point of the video was to kind of just film yourself trying to eat a Tide Pod and getting a reaction. Your face of how you were trying to chew it, your face when you actually had the flavor and the, well, detergent in your mouth, and the rather disgusting aftermath of trying to get detergent out of your mouth and hopefully not out of your stomach. Similar to the whole outlet challenge, I feel like this challenge really took off because of how accessible it was to anybody. Like, if you're a kid in your mom's basement and you just happen to be scrolling TikTok and you saw somebody with 1 million likes eating a Tide Pod and spitting it out, well, all you would have to do is to go in the laundry room, get a Tide Pod, film yourself doing it, and boom, you're just as cool as that guy. And it's, in my opinion, because of this ease of access that this entire trend became as big as it eventually did. And while this challenge may seem simple and innocent enough, the outcomes were anything but that. Taking a step backwards, you kind of have to understand that the reason why the Tide Pod challenge was even viral in the first place was because Tide Pods were so obviously inedible and, well, toxic. Like, there was a reason there was no apple challenge because, well, biting into an apple and eating it is, well, normal. But swap that apple for a toxic Tide Pod and now you have some content. Tide Pods themselves may be bright colored, smell good, and look like candy. However, they were the furthest thing from that. And even small amounts of exposure from the chemicals within Tide Pods could lead to chemical burns, seizures, difficulty breathing, and even severe poisoning in extreme cases. It's been reported that between 2016 and 2020, in the United States alone, there was over 35,000 emergency room visits of children under the age of 18 due to the Tide Pod challenge. And in 12.5% of those 35,000 cases, hospitalization was required. And I feel like that just kind of goes to show the power of scale. Because yeah, sure, it may seem innocent enough to some that, oh, I just bit this inedible thing, I spit it out, I took the video, that's it. But when you have millions of people doing it, even if only 0.1% of people have an extreme unfortunate incident, well, that still leads to thousands upon thousands of people, as we saw, in the hospital because of Tide Pods. The Tide Pod epidemic itself got so bad, in fact, that in 2018, New York State introduced legislation that aimed to ban candy-style detergent pods to prevent further damages to children. I really wish that was a joke, but unfortunately, that's a fact. And it's crazy to believe that legislators literally had to try to come up with an idea on how to prevent children from eating Tide Pods. And I suppose there is an argument to be made about, well, the Tide Pods looking candy-like, I suppose, but the reality is the challenge and trend itself were undoubtedly the reason that so many vulnerable and gullible children were partaking and, unfortunately, in some cases, hurting themselves. And while we don't know the true extent of how many people in total have tried to consume a Tide Pod, the fact alone that there was 35,000 hospital visits associated with Tide Pods is enough information to know that this challenge was truly detrimental of the bored youth of the late 2010s. The fire challenge. If I told you that there was a viral internet trend that consisted of simply setting yourself on fire, would you believe me? Obviously not, right? This is obviously the digital equivalent of saying, hey, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you too? It's a rhetorical question that has an obvious answer. No. But what if I told you that the fire challenge was unfortunately a very real and very viral internet trend? And it was exactly as dumb as it sounded. The fire challenge is actually one of the older internet trends that we've discussed so far. And the mainstream popularity of this trend kind of emerged in the early 2010s. The videos of people participating in this challenge were simple. Put something flammable on your hand, typically rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer, light it on fire, look at the cool flames, and then put it out. Obviously dumb, but seemingly simple enough. However, as we've already seen, results and outcomes may vary. In the early 2010s, the challenge started small, people putting a little bit of rubbing alcohol in the palm of their hand to light it, and then put it out. And as these videos gained popularity, people kept raising the ante more and more. Instead of putting rubbing alcohol in the palm of their hand, they would cover their entire hand. Instead of covering their entire hand, they would cover their arm in it. And it even got to the point where people were putting rubbing alcohol on their entire body, lighting themselves on fire for a TikTok, and then attempting to put themselves out, sometimes unsuccessfully. It's my belief once again that this challenge truly took off because of the reasons we've discussed previously. Similar to the Outlet Challenge, it was visibly dramatic, and similar to the Tide Pod Challenge, it was easily accessible. Any kid who was scrolling on Vine at the time or TikTok in the more modern times could watch somebody set themselves on fire and go, my mom has rubbing alcohol in the bathroom, she has a lighter beside her candle, I can do this right now and go viral. And unfortunately, that's what happened for a lot of kids. I'm sure at least some of you, and maybe even most of you, have seen videos online of people doing this challenge and unfortunately failing miserably, as there is a lot of viral videos of people partaking in this challenge and it just simply didn't go well. Fortunately, in most of these examples, these people at least had a quarter of a brain because they would perform this challenge in the shower. But even in those cases, it wasn't a foolproof plan, because I can remember from memory a video of a guy in a shower covered in rubbing alcohol, setting himself on fire, and before he could even put himself out, he falls, knocks over the alcohol, sets the entire bathroom on fire, and just leaves the bathroom before even turning the shower on. And while you don't see the aftermath of that video, I can only imagine it was detrimental. Most of the viral videos surrounding the fire challenge don't show the outcome, but some of the more unfortunate results include severe burns, infections from those burns, permanent scarring, and in some cases, even death. And reported deaths have happened because of this challenge. One of the more recent examples took place in 2023, when an Arizona teen named Corey Lee suffered burns on more than half of his body as a result of the fire challenge. Corey specifically was trying to do a variation of the fire challenge known as the fireball challenge, where you don't even set yourself on fire, you simply try to create a homemade fireball. I truly don't think I need to go into too much more detail on why it's not smart and obviously dangerous to literally set yourself on fire, but I did want to add more context around the whole fire challenge because, believe it or not, this was a pretty widespread trend, and it also has had resurgences over the last decade. And unfortunately, as we've seen, children are still dying in the 2020s due to the lack of education around these seemingly innocent but unfortunately deadly internet trends. The Milk Crate Challenge. This TikTok epidemic was likely the result of pandemic boredom. In case you've never heard of the Milk Crate Challenge, you don't have to eat a milk crate or you don't have to fit your body into a milk crate. The Milk Crate Challenge basically involves creating a sort of pyramid-based structure out of milk crates and then trying to cross it successfully. The challenge kind of blew up initially in 2021 on TikTok, and these viral videos showed people either successfully crossing super tall milk crate pyramids, or in most cases, getting about halfway up the pyramid only to then lose balance and have the entire milk crate pyramid fall over, and well, the video would end. These viral clips were funny to watch, seeming like just a regular fail video, somebody falling down, haha, whatever. But once again, with a desire for views comes upping the ante, and that's exactly what happened. The Milk Crate Challenge quickly grew bigger and bigger, with people building taller pyramids on more unsteady surfaces. And of course, with this increased danger in height, there was absolutely no increase in safety precautions, unfortunately leading to more virality, further feeding the beast. The Milk Crate Challenge, unlike some of the other challenges we've discussed, is a bit different because it's not necessarily only a feat of bravery, it's also a feat of physical endurance. To some, the Milk Crate Challenge was nearly an Olympic-level display of balance, speed, precision, and ultimately stupidity. Because it's no secret that milk crates are not the most sturdy structure, especially when you stack them 10 tall and stand on them while moving relatively quickly. And of course, the result of this extremely viral and, well, extremely dumb challenge was the following. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, there was over 8,100 emergency room visits as a direct result from this trend. And the most common injury associated with this trend was concussions, broken bones, and even paralysis in extreme cases. While at a first glance, the Milk Crate Challenge kind of just seems like a game show that you can build in your own backyard, you know, basically a mini redneck America's Ninja Warrior, absolutely nobody participating in this challenge got a prize. Unless you consider a concussion a prize, but I personally wouldn't. Interestingly, my whole philosophy of access doesn't necessarily apply here, at least not in my personal experience, because sure, it's easy enough to build a milk crate pyramid, but who has like 20, 30, 40, 50 milk crates? Maybe that's just a Canadian thing because we put our milk in bags, but I personally have never experienced in my childhood or adult life an abundance of milk crates or a desire to climb them in an unsafe manner. I feel like to some people it may seem controversial to put the Milk Crate Challenge as more crazy than the Fire Challenge, but the reason why I did this was because the Fire Challenge was at least obviously dumb and you would truly have to be hungry for attention or a brain to try it for yourself. However, the Milk Crate Challenge seemed a bit more innocent, and I would argue that it's for that reason it ultimately resulted in more injuries and death, which is why, in my opinion, it's likely more crazy. But speaking of crazy, it's crazy that nearly 75% of you are watching this video right now and are not subscribed. We just hit 1 million subscribers, we post fire videos every Friday, and we're now on the road to 2 million subscribers. If you like the videos I make, well, be a bro and subscribe. Now let's get to our next challenge. the Blackout Challenge. At this point in the video, you're probably thinking to yourself, if they made a challenge called the Eat Poop and Jump Off the Roof Challenge, people would do it. And you're probably not wrong. However, I did want to show a bit of sympathy for this next challenge because although it is relatively obviously dangerous, it's also one of the more innocent seeming challenges that has led to the unfortunate demise of so many innocent children. The Blackout Challenge, or the choking game, might be the oldest challenge on this entire video and actually predates the entire internet itself. I'm going to be focusing on the Blackout Challenge specifically, although the choking game has a similar goal, similar execution, and similar outcome. The entire point of the Blackout Challenge is to restrict oxygen flow to the brain, specifically to feel a state of euphoria and to also nearly lose consciousness without fully losing it. In the pre-internet times during the choking game, people would typically do this with their friends to experience the feeling of having that restricted oxygen flow to the brain. However, in more recent times, people would do this with their friends and film it to gain popularity online to show the reaction to essentially losing consciousness and literally losing brain cells. How the Blackout Challenge would typically work is one person would essentially take a deep breath in while another person would simultaneously give them a strong bear hug from behind until that person passed out from a lack of oxygen. Typically, as a result of this lack of oxygen, people would fall over and act drunk for a few moments before regaining consciousness. And these videos would go viral specifically among young people because of how crazy the effects were. Now, here's the deal. Some young people watching these videos just thought it was cool to see somebody act so weird and thought it was, almost like a morbid curiosity. However, some young people were very curious to have this experience for themselves, seeing it almost as a way to get high without doing drugs or alcohol. And this is a major dangerous factor in this entire challenge because young people seeing people do this online gave them a false sense of security that, oh, I'll feel funny or dizzy, but I'll be fine right after. And everybody online's doing it, so I can do it. When in reality, it's actually that false sense of confidence that provides so much risk. Not necessarily to one individual particularly, but because, once again, with scale, more people are trying it, there's more opportunities for things to go wrong. And go wrong, they did. You see, believe it or not, oxygen deprivation in the brain is extremely dangerous. And even brief interruptions of oxygen in your brain can cause seizure, long-term brain damage, heart complications, and even death in more ways than one. With the most common cause of death being asphyxiation, however, the second most common cause of death was actually head injury. That's because in some cases, people trying this challenge would lose consciousness and then fall and hit their head, in some cases either causing instant death or an injury that resulted in death not long after, which is just heartbreaking. The whole Blackout Challenge has claimed victims as young as 10 years old, and it's simply all because people saw it online, they thought it was safe, they thought it was a way that they could just feel silly for a few moments, when in reality, it's not that you just feel dizzy and silly, you are literally depriving your most important organ of its most important nutrient. And sure, the videos online may seem silly, but attempting to do this yourself is literally putting your life at risk. However, the target audience of this challenge was, for the most part, unaware of that fact. And the results, as we've discussed and seen, have truly been unfortunate. And that's kind of one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to make this video. A, to discuss some truly ludicrous and just outrageous trends that people have actually done, and also to try to hopefully spread some awareness. If you see people doing something online that seems dangerous or looks dumb, it probably is, and you probably shouldn't do it. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna say, in basically no case should you do something you see people doing online. Not to be grandpa bro, but if we've learned anything from this video, it's that, well, internet challenges are not your friend. And I guess before we get to the last entry of this video, I just want to say, if you guys have enjoyed this video about crazy internet trends, unfortunately, there is many more that I could discuss, and I obviously couldn't fit them all in one video. So if you guys want a part 2 to this video, leave a like below, or just leave a comment saying part 2, and I would be more than happy to make that video for you. But with that being said, let's move on to the last entry of this video, the Kia Challenge. So far in this video, we've discussed challenges that are either destructive to others' property or your personal body. But this final entry on this list is a challenge that does both. The Kia Challenge started on TikTok in roughly 2022, and it was started by a group of teenagers who later became known as the Kia Boys. And the Kia Boys went viral because they were posting videos of themselves seemingly non-stop of them breaking into Kia and Hyundai vehicles using simple tools, starting them in under a minute, and then joyriding them in the most dangerous and dumb ways. I'm assuming most of you have seen or at least heard of the Kia Boys, but if you haven't, well, you're in for a treat. Like I mentioned, in the early 2020s, it was discovered that almost every Kia and Hyundai model had a major flaw. There was no engine immobilizer, meaning that if you had very basic tools and, well, very basic knowledge, you could break into these cars, start them, and you had a brand new car at your disposal. And with how popular Kia and Hyundai models have been in recent years, the Kia boys and anybody wanting to try the Kia challenge basically had instant access to the focal point of this challenge. Obviously, when these videos started popping up on TikTok around 2022, they were going extremely viral because of how insane they were. Kids were breaking into random Kias, starting them within a minute, joyriding them in the most dangerous of ways, typically speeding, hanging out the side of them, ramming into their vehicles, and then just ditching them and doing it all again. Sometimes numerous times in the same night. Obviously, I don't think I need to go into excruciating detail on why people with no license driving stolen cars at reckless speeds in neighborhoods is dangerous to literally everybody, but, well, in case you're missing part of your brain yourself, the biggest dangers associated with this challenge are, of course, danger to roadgoers, danger to pedestrians, danger to the people that are in the cars, whether they be the burglar or people that are simply friends with the burglar that simply thought a joyride could be fun. And on top of the potential loss of life or injury that could be caused out of the stupidity, of course, we have property damage. Obviously, we have the individual that is likely just trying to get by who has just had their car damaged and stolen, but we also have all of the property damage caused by these joyrides that typically hit other vehicles, street signs, power poles, mailboxes, you name it, a Kia boy, Kia car has hit it. And it seemed like in 2022, there was simply no stopping the Kia boys, and these videos were viral. Not only videos from the Kia boys themselves, but also videos of people trying it, news clips of the news covering the Kia boys, and even interviews with the Kia boys from different YouTubers. The whole Kia boys trend and phenomenon became so popular that even TikTok got backlash for even hosting the content of these people doing it. And this trend was simply one of those trends that, while it's crazy to assume that somebody can be inspired to just steal a car by watching a video, because of how viral and prevalent this whole trend and phenomenon was, there was a massive spike of Grand Theft Autos during this time, which led to a plethora of viral videos, a plethora of injuries, a handful of deaths, and ultimately massive reform for automakers to ensure that this would never happen again. I think the overarching theme on this entire video is the fact that, sure, it may be interesting or shocking or even funny to see one of these videos online, somebody eating a Tide Pod or setting themselves on fire or falling off a milk crate. But what I really wanted to highlight in this video is that, sure, the 5 seconds you see may be shocking or funny or crazy, but the reality of that situation is much more dangerous than you could ever assume. Not only because the person you saw in that video might be permanently injured, but also because the video that you saw and thought was funny, somebody else saw and thought was inspiring. And, well, their lack of education and misplaced inspiration could have led to serious bodily harm. The richest people in human history. In the modern day, the position of world's richest person fluctuates pretty often, and these fluctuations are typically based off of stock price and other economic factors. And while it's interesting to talk about who the richest person in the modern day is, if you have an inquisitive mind, these thoughts may bring you to the question of who was the richest person in other time periods, and who was the richest person in human history. In this video, we're going to answer both of these questions and more, starting at the very beginning of human civilization, the Stone Age. It may serve as no surprise that because the Stone Age is, well, for the most part, prehistoric, we don't have any verifiable sources of wealthy individuals. That being said, that doesn't mean that we don't know what wealth looked like in the Stone Age, and for that reason, I wanted to at least quickly mention it. As I've mentioned in a few of our previous time period videos, wealth in the Stone Age was measured strictly in your ability to survive. And the things that granted your survival in the Stone Age were food, shelter, water, and community. And while those things may have no monetary value, in the Stone Age, being alive is a lot better than being dead with a pile of money. If you were rich in the Stone Age, you had a strong tribe around you. Your group consisted of strong, successful, ferocious hunters, attentive and expert gatherers, and passionate mothers taking care of the young. Humans in the Stone Age needed each other to survive, mainly because every aspect of life was work, and you can't do everything all by yourself. But in a tribe, tasks can be done by multiple people, allowing the group to survive. But outside of just tasks, the group also provided protection from natural predators, because in the Stone Age, humans weren't at the top of the food chain, and there was very much so natural predators that were wanting to eat you. But of course, community isn't the only thing that gave you wealth. Besides having this strong, tight-knit tribe, you also ensure that your tribe is located in a fruitful area of land. And what I mean by this is that hunting is bountiful. Animals consistently graze near your tribe, making hunting easy and consistent. But beyond just having a good location with consistent food and pelts, it's important that you have access to water, which is why you and your very wealthy tribe also have a perfectly clean stream going right beside your tribe's location. This stream provides your tribe not only with water, but also fish and transportation. But even with all of these Stone Age luxuries, there is still one more way that your tribe could have more wealth, and that is by having the best shelter possible. And in the Stone Age, one of the best options was a natural formation, typically a cave that provided shelter from storms and hot weather, consistent moderate temperatures, and once again, protection from natural predators. And while the bar may seem relatively low for the Stone Age, everything I just described was literally a dream come true. And if you happen to have all of these in your life, you were by far the wealthiest person to live. And by wealthiest, I just mean you were alive, because poverty in the Stone Age was literally just death. So even though our caveman ancestors didn't have much, and we can't verify who was the richest person at the time, it's at least interesting to understand what made a wealthy life during this time period, and it's also a good reminder that life is a blessing. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James, the Bronze Age, the time period that comes after the Stone Age. And luckily for us, we have verifiable evidence of who the richest person was during this time period. Wealth in the Bronze Age already looks worlds different than it did in the Stone Age. And that's because during the Bronze Age, human societal development really hit an exponential curve. And while the Stone Age literally went on for millions of years and only really yielded rudimentary structures and stone tools, the Bronze Age is where we really see society develop into small villages and also forging with metals. Most notably in this time period, bronze. With the development of society, culture, and tools, we now have a new definition of wealth. And fortunately, we also have documented history. However, I am using that term lightly because although we do have some texts referring to the reign and wealth of King Solomon, many of them came many years after his lifetime. So take some of these testimonies with a grain of salt. The year is 970 BC, and the Kingdom of Israel is now under new management. King Solomon was the successor to his father, King David. It's estimated that King Solomon's rule ran from 970 BC to 931 BC. An impressive 39 years. And keep in mind, during this time period, even living to see 39 was an accomplishment. But longevity is not the point of this video, and what's even more impressive than his reign was his wealth. It's recorded that under the reign of King Solomon, his kingdom actually earned its highest splendor and wealth of all time, with record revenues reaching 666 talents of gold in a single year, which is an ironic number, but that equates to over 18,125 kilograms of gold earned in a single year. Keep in mind, the reason we're talking in precious metal volumes and not, well, dollar values is because during this time, money didn't even exist. Not even any form of coinage. Precious metals were truly the only store of value, meaning that gold was truly the gold standard. And for that reason, King Solomon got a lot of it. And how he got this gold may not be so much of a shock. As the king of a nation, Solomon's wealth primarily came through tax revenue. But on top of this massive tax revenue, he also earned money through trade alliances and also control over important trade routes that linked Africa, Asia, and Europe together. But like any good business mogul, he didn't end there. Solomon was also involved in mining, agriculture, and also building projects funded by the kingdom's resources itself, meaning that not only did he have a massive personal net worth, but he also had, well, basically infinite money at his expense through the wealth of the nation that he managed. And because of the prosperity that Solomon's kingdom saw during his long reign, it's estimated that King Solomon's net worth would be valued at anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion, which is insane. And since it's kind of variable, let's just average it at 2.5 trillion. Now, like I mentioned earlier, almost all of the information available about Solomon came from the Bible, which isn't an issue until you realize that Solomon lived and died hundreds of years before the Bible took place, essentially. So once again, for that reason, take this one with a grain of salt, but it's definitely an interesting first entry. And while we're on the topic of the Bible and interesting, not only did the Bible mention how wealthy King Solomon was, but they also mentioned how, well, promiscuous he was. And it's literally stated in the Bible that King Solomon had over 700 wives, and because that wasn't enough, he also had an additional 300 concubines, meaning that this dude literally not only had trillions of dollars, but also had 1,000 girls in his roster. The Iron Age. Interestingly, the Iron Age is not much different than the Bronze Age, and the brief period transitioning from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was actually a pretty tumultuous time. And while that's kind of beyond the scope of this video, society essentially took 2 steps forward in the Bronze Age, and then 1 step back, and then 2 steps forward again into the Iron Age. And while once humanity sort of stabilized again within the Iron Age, it didn't look too different from the Bronze Age besides one key difference: the main metal at play, obviously being iron. But beyond the introduction of iron, we also see refinements and growth within the civilizations that were formed in the Bronze Age, or at least the ones that survived it. Consider that subtle foreshadowing. Now, once again, one of the richest people to ever exist, and most likely one of the richest people in all of the Iron Age, was a man known as King Croesus. And Croesus was the king of Lydia, a wealthy kingdom that existed in modern-day Turkey. Croesus had a relatively short reign only reigning from 560 BC to 546 BC, roughly 14 years. But during this time, Croesus became an icon of wealth. And he was so rich, in fact, that the phrase, as rich as Croesus, actually not only gained steam during his reign, but also existed for millennia after his death. But the story of Croesus and Lydia isn't all sunshine and rainbows, because although he did have immense wealth, his reign and life did eventually end up being cut short. But before we describe that, how exactly did he earn all this wealth? As a king, it may come as no surprise that Croesus' wealth was primarily earned through taxation, trade routes, and natural resources within the Kingdom of Lydia. Interestingly, in the Kingdom of Lydia, there was literally a river that was full of something known as electrum, which was essentially a naturally occurring alloy of silver and gold, which is pretty fortunate. But not only was Croesus known for being rich, but he also changed money forever. He actually started minting some of the world's first coins ever, standardizing the world's first gold and silver coins. And he did this so he could A, centralize his wealth, and B, strengthen the economy of his entire kingdom. And his idea of forming precious metal coins took off and spread across, eventually, the entire world. But as I mentioned, the story of Croesus is one of large wealth, but also one of large hubris. And it's claimed in ancient texts that it was the hubris of Croesus that led to his and his kingdom's eventual downfall. During Croesus' peak, the Kingdom of Lydia was rich, expanding, and even had alliances with Greek city-states. And Croesus himself was synonymous with wealth and power. And it's believed that because of all of this success and power, Croesus got a bit too confident, and this confidence caused him to challenge Cyrus the Great of Persia, Persia being another opposing empire at the time. Croesus felt confident that he could expand his empire and take on Persia, but first he made sure to contact an oracle, and it's written that this oracle that Croesus consulted prophesied that, quote, Croesus would destroy a great empire. And it's believed that Croesus interpreted this message as he had already won the war, so he could begin it and win with ease. Although the opposite was true, and the empire that Croesus would destroy was actually his own. And in 546 BC, Lydia fell to Persia, and it's believed that Croesus was either executed or spared and turned into an advisor for Cyrus. At the peak of his net worth, it's estimated that Croesus had roughly a net worth of $500 billion. Which, I mean, compared to the previous trillionaire, doesn't sound that much, but this net worth is still insanely impressive. And remember, like King Solomon, this wealth was not stored in cash, stocks, crypto. This money was in physical gold and silver. And dude had so much money and so much time that he literally decided to create coinage. I bet King Solomon would have created coinage too if he wasn't messing around with 1,000 women. The classical era. The classical era is where things begin to get really interesting because history is getting more and more documented and wealth is becoming more and more, well, common. That being said, when I had to choose one rich person to represent the classical era, the option was obvious, and it started with me thinking about one of the most iconic empires that existed during the classical era, that being the Roman Empire. And when you think of Roman Empire, who do you think of? Julius Caesar wouldn't have been a wrong answer, but believe it or not, Julius Caesar wasn't actually the richest Roman. However, who is regarded as one of the richest, if not the richest Roman, was his adopted son, Augustus Caesar. And Augustus Caesar was getting that bag. Augustus Caesar was born in 63 BC, and after winning probably the biggest lottery in all of human history, he was adopted by Julius Caesar, the infamous dictator of Rome at the time. Augustus was brought up surrounded by wealth, power, influence, and strategy, and truly learned the ropes from one of the most iconic people to ever live. That being said, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, there was a massive power vacuum, and Augustus had some major shoes to fill. However, he did exactly that. And not only did he rise to power through political skill, but he also formed strategic alliances and had numerous military victories under his belt. And because of this, at the relatively young age of only 36, Augustus Caesar actually officially formed the Roman Empire. If you're a fan of the channel, then you know that we've talked about the Roman Empire at length through our almost 100 videos. And ironically, my second video ever was actually a video about why the Roman Empire fell. And while that's outside the scope of the video, I thought I would mention it, because the Roman Empire has way more lore than I can summarize right now. Let's focus back in on Augustus. Following suit with other kings and leaders we've discussed so far, Augustus accumulated his massive wealth through the major expansion of the Roman territory, massive conquests, and the spoils of war. On top of this, having one of the strongest empires allowed him to have a steady stream of taxation, provincial revenues, and even tributes from conquered land. And conquer land he did, Augustus' fortune was tied to the control of land across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, which obviously just was the Roman Empire, but it's crazy to think the sheer scale of this entire place that he controlled. And interestingly, historians estimate that in today's money, the net worth of Augustus would be in the trillions of dollars, likely in the 3 to 4 trillion range. But this is largely because as the emperor of the Roman Empire, he essentially controlled and owned everything within it. Like, just imagine you're working at an Amazon warehouse and Jeff Bezos walks in and just starts taking stuff off the shelves. I mean, nobody's gonna stop him, and technically it's his, but at the same time, it's also the company's, and the lines really start to get blurred. Regardless, Augustus Caesar had an insane career, both politically and economically. And for that reason, he's not only remembered as the founder of the Roman Empire, the son of Julius Caesar, but also as one of the richest men to ever live, with a net worth of, let's say, $3 trillion. The medieval era. History is really heating up with the medieval era, and we are once again getting more and more interesting entries to this list and more data to verify some of these claims. That being said, we're still in the realm of estimation. Although in the medieval era, we have some very interesting estimates to discuss. And I want to start our medieval journey not in medieval Europe, but actually in the steppes of Mongolia. In the year 1162, a young boy named Temujin was born, and little did his family know Temujin would become one of the most famous and prolific people to ever live. And while this boy was named Temujin, you likely know him better as Genghis Khan. The same Genghis Khan that founded the Mongol Empire, which was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. And the wealth of Genghis Khan is actually quite different from the others we've discussed so far, and the others that we're going to discuss as well. Quite frankly, being the founder and ruler of one of the largest empires to ever exist, there is a very likely chance that Genghis Khan could have been the richest person in all of human history. However, there's a very important asterisk on that point. Genghis Khan was not one for personal wealth. And while the empire he was the sole heir to was extremely prosperous and rich in both land, resources, livestock, food, and army, Genghis himself did not store much value. He rather decided to invest back into the army to continue the expansion of the Mongolian Empire, which is likely a major contributing factor why the Mongolian Empire was so unstoppable for so long. Genghis ate, slept, lived, and dressed like a majority of his army. And while the actions done by Genghis Khan are, for the most part, deplorable, and the majority of his entire empire was funded by the pillaging and destruction of any other civilization they could, find essentially, it is still somewhat noble that Genghis decided to remain close to his modest roots and invest the wealth that his empire brought him back into his empire to further expand it. And while estimates for Genghis Khan's net worth range from anywhere from a few trillion to over 100 trillion, I would say that Genghis Khan's net worth is almost negligible considering how he viewed money. But because we need a number on this list, let's just call it 100 trillion in access, but maybe 100 billion in execution. Money he actually spent on his own personal lifestyle. And honestly, I think even that's a bit overinflated. The Mongolian people were extremely nomadic, meaning that storing wealth was not necessarily a convenient thing to do. And unless you're Steve from Minecraft, you probably can't store $100 trillion worth of gold in your back pocket. Since Genghis Khan was relatively a modest individual, even though he was likely one of the most powerful people to ever live, I wanted to add a secondary entry for the medieval era, someone you'll likely recognize if you're familiar with ancient wealthy people. This next individual is a man known as Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa, in many regards, is considered to be the most wealthy person to ever exist ever. Full stop. And while there's definitely an argument to back up that claim, we'll discuss how accurate that is at the end of the video. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire from roughly 1312 AD to 1337 AD. And under the power of Mansa Musa, Mali was able to reach its peak power, influence, and wealth, controlling almost every key trade route across West Africa. But more notably, Musa's wealth came from the control of trade of salt and gold, which were extremely prevalent in West Africa at the time. But he didn't just profit off the trade of salt and gold. He also profited off the trade of ivory, slaves, spices, and other goods. Or should I say bads, because I don't think calling slaves goods is, well, good. He profited off goods and bads, okay? Regardless, Musa's net worth was immense, and it only grew when he took his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. It was this pilgrimage that not only grew his net worth, but also increased his international fame. Musa traveled with a massive 60,000 person entourage, and he did so because he needed many people to carry all of the gold that he was earning and traveling with. And because he was traveling with so much gold, he would actually just give it away at different cities he was stopping in. And because of this, in cities like Cairo in Egypt, the gold that Musa was just giving away for free actually disrupted local economies. But yeah, Musa was literally kitted out in full gold armor, all gold tools, had an army of 60,000 people in all gold armor, an additional 60,000 camels with all gold armor, an inventory full of gold blocks. This guy made Mr. T's neck look naked, but at least he was generous. So generous, in fact, that he literally caused inflation. But here's where things get interesting. While every number we've discussed is an estimate, the estimate for Mansa Musa is relatively modest, with a net worth believed to be roughly around $400 billion, which is still massive and more money than the richest person in 2025 has, although it's nowhere near the trillions we've discussed before. And after doing some research, I almost feel like Mansa Musa is known as the richest person to ever live simply because he was talked about so much in ancient texts, because this guy was just a G. If you saw a dude in all gold with 60,000 other gold people just giving out gold, I would probably believe that was the richest guy ever too. But that's not to discredit his legacy. The early modern era. Once again, there's so many good entries for this time period, we're doing a double feature. And we're starting with a man named Jacob Fugger. And Jacob Fugger is a real Fugger indeed. And that's because this man got so rich that he actually had more power over the kings in Europe. And that is saying something. Jacob Fugger was born into a wealthy family and started his career in the textile industry that his family was deeply invested in. Although it didn't take time for Jacob to realize that there was higher leverage opportunities out there. And he shifted his focus from being a merchant to being a bank for merchants. And with that, he made a massive fortune. And with that fortune, he got into some very interesting situations, specifically funding politicians to have power in parliament, and also by expanding his mining operation to create essentially a monopoly over the copper market in Europe. Jacob Fugger had so much money that he was literally known as Jacob Fugger the Rich. But he wasn't only known as a businessman. Like I mentioned, his career in politics made him known as a kingmaker, because he was giving out massive loans to Maximilian I and Charles V, both of which who ended up becoming massively powerful people within Europe. But Fugger wasn't only funding kings, he literally financed the creation of the Vatican. And to bankroll the construction of the Vatican, he actually started minting his own coins known as papal coins. And it was actually with Fugger's involvement with the Vatican that led to the eventual sale of indulgences, which was literally a ticket to heaven, which eventually sparked the entire Protestant Reformation. Regardless, Jacob Fugger was a very rich man. From textiles to mining to banker, Fugger did it all. And while he didn't do it all ethically, he did it. And it's estimated that his personal net worth was roughly 2% of Europe's GDP at the time, which would equate to roughly $400 billion in today's money. And interestingly, Jacob Fugger's net worth is one of the most provable net worths we've discussed so far, considering there are many records to validate these claims that are publicly available and, well, still exist. So even though 400 billion doesn't sound super impressive at this point in time, the power that he held as a non-royal was insane. And his net worth is likely one of the most accurate and non-inflated we've discussed so far. But like I mentioned, we got a double feature, so let's get that Fugger out of the way and discuss Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great was the third emperor of the Mughal Empire in India, and he ruled this empire from 1556 until his death in 1605. Interestingly, Akbar gained access to the throne at only 13 years old, when his father tragically died. And while giving a 13-year-old reign over an entire empire sounds like a horrible idea and has been proven to be multiple times throughout history, for Akbar, it actually worked out. It's almost like being a child actor. In most cases, it works out horribly, but sometimes it actually kind of does work out. His reign is remembered for vast land expansion, the flourishing of Indian culture, and strong central governance, which was largely missing at the time. And it was these primary contributing factors that made the Mughal Empire one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the early modern era. The wealth that Akbar generated for the Mughal Empire was actually primarily driven by agriculture, as the lands of northern India were extremely fertile. But of course, in addition to this agriculture, he also made most of his money from taxation, both taxing those crops and other goods. On top of agriculture and taxation, once again, control of trade routes was a steady stream of income that allowed the Mughal Empire to grow and flourish. And due to this political success and economic growth, he ended up making the empire extremely rich, like 25% of the entire world's GDP rich, which equates to roughly $30 trillion in today's money. And unlike Genghis Khan, Akbar knew how to spend some money. He was known for his opulence, and so were his courtrooms and official government buildings. I wanted to add these two examples specifically for the early modern era because the examples are so vastly different, both in how they started their lives, acquired their wealth, and obviously the shocking difference in net worth between these two individuals. But keep in mind, for Akbar specifically, this 25% of global GDP is the wealth of the empire he controlled, not his personal wealth. And while that line was relatively blurred, even if we say he conservatively only paid himself 10% of that, we can estimate that his personal net worth was roughly around 3 trillion, although he had access to up to 30 trillion. So I'll let you be the judge of that. The modern era. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally made it to the time period that we are currently existing in. With that being said, the modern era is considered to be from 1800 to today, meaning that we have a lot of ground to cover and many notable and documented individuals to discuss. So for that reason, I'm going to make this last time period a bit of a speed round. I want to first discuss Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who lived from 1794 to 1877, and he was a man who was known as the first American business tycoon. And that he was. Vanderbilt built his fortune primarily through shipping routes and railroads, and he started his career as a ferry operator in the New York City harbor, where he was first exposed to commercial transportation, which later inspired him to start his focus on railroads and expansion across all of America. That being said, Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily a good guy, and he actually earned the name of robber baron as well, because he would typically use monopolistic strategies and market manipulation in his favor to buy railroads as cheaply as possible and extract the most value out of them. Regardless, Vanderbilt is known as one of the men that built America as we know it today, and the railroad systems that he established connecting U.S. cities and boosting American trade are still marveled at to this very day. At the time of his death, Vanderbilt's net worth was roughly $3 billion in today's money. And interestingly, when he died, he was worth more than the U.S. Treasury. So even though $3 billion sounds puny in the video, within context, that number is massive. Cornelius died in 1877, and interestingly, in 1973, only 100 years later, it was found out that during a family reunion, there was not one single millionaire left in the family. That's right, the Vanderbilt family literally blew billions of dollars in less than 100 years through financial mismanagement and I'm sure other reasons. And besides Cornelius, another major player during the beginning of the modern era was a man known as John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, he did. Rockefeller was one of the most prolific industrialists in American history, and he was the founder of the Standard Oil Company during the Industrial Revolution, a time when oil was an emerging market. And he was not only capitalizing on it, he was monopolizing on it. I think it's also important to note that during this time, business was nowhere near what it's like today. Like if you're complaining about modern day capitalism, then you should have seen 1800s capitalism. There was absolutely no regard for the environment, other business people, families, children, nothing. The Industrial Revolution was full of factories that had pregnant women and children working all day, with reckless disposal of industrial waste, and the most strong-arm, backstabby business tactics you've literally ever heard of. 1800s Industrial Revolution business was not for the faint of heart. And fortunately for Rockefeller, this was a game he was willing to play. When Rockefeller launched Standard Oil in 1870, he grew the company rapidly by essentially undercutting all of his competition. And then with the revenue he gained through undercutting this competition, he then bought out all of his competitors. And only 2 years after starting Standard Oil in 1872, there was a small few-month streak where Rockefeller bought 22 of the 26 oil refineries in Cleveland alone. And this purchasing streak was so impactful on Cleveland that it was literally known as the Cleveland Massacre. But Rockefeller didn't just undercut and buy every oil refinery he could. He also made sure to integrate vertically, controlling everything from the production, transportation, and sales of any oil product. And during the late 1870s, Standard Oil was literally refining over 90% of America's oil. And eventually, people were fed up with it. And I think in some cases, Rockefeller was truly seen as the first real example of true corporate greed, a symbol and theme that would continue until, well, today. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, got so big, in fact, that in 1911, the Supreme Court forced him to break up his company into 34 smaller companies, which he did, and ironically, this division only led to an increase of net worth for Rockefeller. Rockefeller was not a good guy, but there are a lot of things we use every single day that have been influenced from his work, and it was people like him that built the society we live in today, whether you like it or not. Rockefeller's net worth was estimated to be equivalent to almost 2% of all of the US's GDP, and he's also considered to be the world's first billionaire. And while there's definitely other honorable mentions from the beginning part of the modern era, like the Rothschilds and Henry Ford, I want to fast forward to the modern day to discuss some of the richest people in 2025, and also reflect on all of the rich people we've discussed and determine who is the richest of all. As of today, the world's richest man is largely believed to be Elon Musk. But besides Elon Musk, some other notable billionaires include Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, and Bernard Arnault. And while I think most of us understand who these people are and how they made their money, I think it's important to reflect on how their net worths differ from people in the past. For example, you don't see Elon Musk storing all of his net worth in gold or taking a 60,000 person pilgrimage across Africa with gold armor on. A majority of his wealth is in shares, stocks, and is largely based off of the evaluation of the companies that he owns. Now, if we stack up Elon Musk's net worth of roughly $382 billion at the time of recording this video, he actually ranks relatively low in the context of this list. And for that reason, this video is about to get rather subjective, because to answer the question question of who's the richest person in human history, there's a few different answers, at least in my opinion. If you want to base the ranking of history's richest person based off the numerical value, which, I mean, is logical, then I would say that honestly Genghis Khan has an extremely strong case for richest person ever. Although, if you want to base it off popular vote, there is a lot of people, for good reason, that believe that Mansa Musa was the richest person to ever walk this earth. However, if you're asking me who the richest person in all of human history is, genuinely, I would say that there has to be more factors beyond just wealth we consider. Because while Genghis Khan may have potentially had the most access to wealth, he personally wasn't extremely wealthy and also lived a lifestyle I have absolutely no interest in. And to be frank, I really don't have much interest in living any time before, I guess, 1990. The reason being, maybe I'm just spoiled, but I enjoy modern luxuries of today. And I would argue that somebody with a minimum wage job in America today lives a much better life than a king did in medieval times. Specifically because the technology, medicine, entertainment, and modern luxuries far outweigh any amount of gold, at least in my opinion. And I guess you have to ask yourself, do you want to be in a castle with a jester and a pile of unlimited gold? Or do you want a toilet that flushes, air conditioning, and access to YouTube to watch Trust Me Bro? That's the question. I'll let you decide in the comments. But if you're asking me who I think the richest person in all of human history is, I would definitely argue that Elon Musk takes the cake. Simply because his net worth is massive, he's the most prosperous man in the most prosperous era of human history, and he's also able to enjoy his money during the best time to ever live in human history, which is today, in my opinion. If you made it this far in the video, obviously you're invested. Leave a comment below letting me know who you think the richest person in history is and why. I gave you my opinion, and I want to remind you, it's just my opinion. It's nothing serious. And in case you're already mad writing a mean comment, just read the name of the channel. How the most notorious serial killers were caught. The year is 1888, and you are located in Whitechapel, England, one of the roughest areas in London's East End. You, like most of the people in your life and in Whitechapel, don't live a life of luxury at all. You struggle to make ends meet, and tonight don't even have the 2 pence to pay for a place to sleep. You used to have a more or less picturesque life until your husband died, and since being on your own, like many women at the time, you resorted to selling your body. Whitechapel wasn't a booming metropolitan area, but it did contain over 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes at the time. So to you, it was a better option than starving. With nowhere else to go, you spent the last few hours at the pub you frequented, and as the pub began to close, the bartender sensed that you weren't able to pay your bill. Unfortunately, they told you tonight it was on the house, as they knew you had fallen onto some tough times. You stumble out of this bar, beyond drunk, into the dark labyrinth that is the Whitechapel streets, and you begin to take the long and ominous walk home. At this time, it had to be at least 2 or 3 in the morning. The street was so dimly lit and the fog was so thick, you could barely see a person standing a few feet in front of you. Luckily, the labyrinth of small roads was something you were more than familiar with and could do with your eyes closed. And while there was nobody on this street beside yourself, you do notice a figure in the distance. Something that you knew wasn't typically there. It wasn't a lamppost, and it wasn't an animal. As you get closer, you realize that it's a man in a dark trench coat and tall hat. As your drunken thoughts begin to process what you're looking at, you realize that this man was your golden ticket. You had just possibly found a place to stay tonight and even a way to make a few dollars. And as you approach this man, you try to put yourself together and approach him confidently. You walk right up to him and tell him that if he's looking for a good time, you can both go back to his place, and before you could even finish your offer, you slowly notice this man developing an unnatural smirk. And before you're even fully able to process this unnerving smile, you notice something. The reflection of what streetlight was available twinkled off of an object that this man just pulled out of his pocket, although it wasn't a pocket watch or change. This man had just pulled out a 7-inch knife. You instantly realize you need to run away as soon as possible, but your alcohol-induced delayed reaction time prevented you from taking any action, and the only thing you could do was let out a gasp before this man raises the knife and cuts your existence short. Only a few hours later, at the very crack of dawn, a man is slowly venturing down a cobblestone road when he sees something on the sidewalk. He notices a woman on the sidewalk. Although this wasn't the typical Whitechapel homeless person. This was a woman face down, surrounded by blood. This man instantly gets out of his buggy, flips this woman over, only to realize that this woman was not only injured, but brutally murdered. Her neck was stabbed multiple times, and her torso was not only stabbed, but mutilated, with her intestines almost spilling out of her torso. This grim and disgusting discovery was one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper, and the start of a hunt for truth that would last over 137 years. There's no doubt that Jack the Ripper is one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious serial killer of all time. And of course, we're going to discuss exactly how he was caught. But before we discuss how he was caught, it's important to understand exactly how he wasn't caught so long ago. Obviously, technology wasn't nearly advanced as it was now, but that doesn't mean that crimes weren't solved. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, there was plenty of situations where Jack was very close to being caught and truthfully should have been caught, but we'll get to that. One of the biggest factors that consistently contributed to Jack the Ripper being able to go on for so long without being identified was the location of where he lived. As I mentioned earlier, Whitechapel was a rough area, and although it was tight and crowded, people weren't necessarily paying attention to others as they had enough to focus on. And weird things going on weren't so weird there. People shouting in the streets, people sleeping in the streets, people fighting, people with blood on their clothes, all weren't necessarily uncommon in a place where people were struggling to survive, dealing with disease, violence, and crime, and truthfully just trying to make it to their next meal, let alone their own next day. This gave Jack a lot of leeway to commit some truly horrendous crimes as long as he wasn't directly in anybody's eyesight. Another major contributing factor to the reason why he wasn't caught at the time is because he was only active for a few years. Obviously, being an active serial killer for any period of time is unacceptable. However, if you've seen any of our videos on serial killers, you would know that some killers are active for decades. At the time, it wasn't known how long Jack the Ripper was active, as his identity was unknown. Although, with the information that we have now, we can pinpoint exactly when he stopped killing and why he did too. But before we discuss that, let's first discuss how Jack the Ripper even earned a name as a serial killer. This brings us back to our initial story. A woman being found dead in the Whitechapel streets wasn't common, but wasn't unheard of. But what was unheard of was the sheer level of mutilation that occurred on her body. If this happened only once, there would be no Jack the Ripper. But the volume and consistency of these attacks in such a short amount of time were what fueled the media to create a monster, and one of the first ever famous serial killers. In 1888 alone, there is 5 confirmed killings associated with Jack the Ripper. These 5 victims are known as the canonical 5. And the reason these 5 victims are confirmed to be victims of Jack the Ripper are because they all exhibit trademarks of Jack's method of murder. All of these 5 women were either underprivileged, vulnerable, or had recently fallen onto hard times. And most notably, all of these victims had been murdered and brutally mutilated in such a specific manner. But it wasn't mutilation alone that created Jack the Ripper's signature murder. It was how precise and consistent these mutilations were. Coroners and doctors who inspected these victims once they were found would all remark that whoever had done this must have been experienced with a knife in some way, whether they were a doctor or a butcher or a shoemaker. And during the time that these murders were being investigated in the late 1800s, people in those exact professions, among others, were questioned, as whoever was wielding this knife and mutilating these women was no amateur. And that is beyond unsettling. As these murders were first being discovered, people believed that there was multiple murderers on the loose, as people were being killed more than ever, and these murders were happening so close to each other. And for 2 of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, they were even murdered in the same night, 45 minutes apart from each other. And for that fact, it's reasonable to assume that it might have been multiple people. However, like I mentioned, the sheer consistency of these mutilations made it hard to believe there was more than one person. And with every murder, the newspaper was feeding more and more into the story that a monster was on the loose. Obviously, the newspapers covered these strange murders to keep locals up to date on what was happening, although some speculate that the newspaper was pushing the story for ulterior motives as well. The name Jack the Ripper didn't come from the police or from the public. It was a name that was referenced in a letter that was sent to the media from somebody claiming to be the murderer. That letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, at that time and until today was considered to be a hoax. However, Jack the Ripper must have gotten word about this hoax and decided to confirm things once and for all. As shortly after the Dear Boss letter was submitted to the media, another letter was submitted to the media, known as the From Hell letter. However, this letter was more convincing, as it wasn't just a written statement from somebody claiming that they were the murderer. It was a letter that stated that it was from the murderer and proved it by including half of a kidney in the letter. This half kidney was from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it was at that point when the newspaper and the general public knew that they had one deranged individual on their hands. And it was also that letter that launched Jack the Ripper from local terror to nationwide and later global infamy. Up until last year, that's basically where the story would have ended. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity was never known, and he was somebody that truly terrorized not only his city, but the world. That was until recently. In 2007, a self-proclaimed Jack the Ripper expert named Russell Edwards bought a shawl. But it wasn't any shawl. He wasn't upgrading his wardrobe. He bought a shawl that was believed to have been owned by one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, but this shawl was also present at a murder scene and was likely to have DNA on it. And it was this purchase that led to one of the biggest cold cases being solved in almost 150 years. Edwards gave this shawl that he had purchased to a biochemist and tasked him with finding any DNA possible. And that's exactly what he did. And only a few years later, a peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis that the biochemist was able to find was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The article that this biochemist published claimed exactly what Russell Edwards had written about all the way back in 2014, that Jack the Ripper was a man named Aaron Kosminski. And while this article has been criticized by scientists for making misassumptions, it does make a pretty compelling case, and at the very least provides a bit more context to the entire Jack the Ripper situation. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11th, 1865 in Poland, but emigrated to England in the 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel in the East End of London, and his occupation was a barber or hairdresser. That alone is interesting because that confirms that Aaron Kosminski was in the area of the Jack the Ripper killings when they happened, and he also was in a profession that wasn't a stranger to sharp objects. But the information gets deeper. In 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his own sister with a knife. Coincidentally, 1891 was the same year that the suspected Jack the Ripper killings stopped happening. Aaron Kosminski spent the rest of his life institutionalized, and while information about his time in these sanitariums is relatively undocumented or at least deeply archived, it is documented that he did suffer with severe schizophrenia, leaving him very troubled. Which is also interesting because the things that Jack the Ripper did would, in my opinion, only be the result of somebody who was truly disturbed. But on top of all of these similarities and coincidences, the biggest claim of the article submitted by the biochemist that Russell Edwards had commissioned was that they claimed to have a DNA link between Aaron Kosminski and DNA found on the shawl of the Jack the Ripper victim. It was actually a 100% DNA match. And that piece of evidence alone was the nail in the coffin, and what sparked a lot of the news you likely saw this year of Jack the Ripper's identity finally being revealed. Over the years, there's been a handful of interesting theories about who Jack the Ripper truly was, but I think the argument that it was Aaron Kosminski is definitely the most compelling. But with that being said, was Jack the Ripper ever truly caught? Well, if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, then his identity was revealed, which means something. But also, if it was Aaron Kosminski, that does mean that he was institutionalized in 1891 for the rest of his life. Meaning that he was imprisoned not for his crimes, but for his illness. His illness that likely sparked these crimes. So although you could argue Jack the Ripper was still not 1000% confirmed, I do think that there is a strong argument that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. And for that reason, I do believe he was caught. But even if you don't agree, I think this story is extremely interesting and adds, if nothing else, new layers to one of the coldest cases in serial killer history. But this is only the first case of 3 that we're covering in this video, so let me summarize. How exactly did Jack the Ripper get caught? According to the evidence we have, he got caught because he was consistently killing. He killed in a very methodical way. He confirmed he was a man acting alone in a letter he wrote to the media. And that letter not only confirmed that he was one person, but also gave the media ammo to create this spectacle that was Jack the Ripper. And it was this spectacle that got him caught. Because if the media didn't make Jack the Ripper the big boogeyman that he was, there would not be Jack the Ripper historians in the modern day. And if there was no Jack the Ripper in the modern day, there would be no collector buying this old shawl that was at the scene of the crime, and there would be nobody to give it to a biochemist to check it for DNA. And it's interesting to think, if Jack the Ripper never had written that letter, would we be talking about him today? And would he have ever been caught? I guess we'll never know. But let's move on. Saturday, August 24th, 1985. You are a 13-year-old boy, and you had just returned home to Southern California from a road trip with your family. The road trip was fun, but the entire time there was an eerie undertone, as your parents and the family you had been visiting out of town were all focused on one subject: the serial killer that had been on the loose in Southern California. You didn't know much of the situation, and truthfully, you weren't too interested, but you overheard your parents talking about some sort of night stalker. And between overhearing your parents and news coverage, it was hard not to have some sort of context about what was going on. And from what you understood, there was this crazy man on the loose who at this point had killed 13 innocent people, and was still not only not caught, but not even identified. This to you was scary, but what was about to happen on this fateful night was going to be a lot scarier. You return home from your family vacation later in the night, and you spent the evening unpacking, something that you delayed doing because you were watching your favorite VHS. It was a movie known as Back to the Future, and it only came out a month prior. And watching this movie kept you up later than usual, and this movie left you excited and unable to sleep, which is why you were up at midnight, which for you was later than usual. The rest of your family was sleeping, so you made sure to be quiet and keep to yourself. It was until you realized that you left your favorite pillow in the family RV, and you weren't going to bed without it, so you had to quietly sneak out to it to get it, obviously without waking your parents. You tiptoe outside, and once you make it into the yard, you hear something that sounds like footsteps, but you're not alarmed. You have a large backyard that's unfenced that backs onto a hill, and seeing possums, raccoons, and even deer weren't necessarily uncommon. And you were curious to see what was making all of this noise. You don't see any animal or anything at all, and figure whatever little critter it was must have scurried away. And since you're outside, you figured, why not go to the garage and work on your bike a little bit? Back to the Future got you inspired to tinker around, and maybe you were about to build the first time-traveling bike. And it was shortly into this tinkering session that you once again heard footsteps. But this time it was different. There was no suspicion of this being an animal. You were certain that you were hearing a person walking around the property. Your biggest fear was that your dad was coming out to see what you were up to, but what was actually outside was much more terrifying. It only took a few moments for you to realize that whoever was outside wasn't your dad, because they didn't enter the garage and they didn't say anything. You had an odd feeling and decided to hide behind the car and realized that you couldn't be here. You bolted out of the garage directly into the house, and as soon as you got into the house, you looked out the window to see exactly what was outside. And that's when you see a man walking around your home. You see this man start to walk away, and before he fully leaves your property, you want to get one last look to see if you know who this man could be and what he was doing there. And as you run from your bedroom out through the kitchen to the garage, your dad stops you in the kitchen and asks you, what are you doing? Why are you up at this hour? Hastily, you tell your dad that there's a man in the yard and you need to see who he is and what he's doing now. And after explaining this entire situation in only a matter of seconds, you shove your dad out of the way and run into the yard, when you catch a glimpse of a figure wearing a baseball cap, a jacket, and blue jeans. And although you can't identify this figure, you see them get into an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack. As this man got into his car, you run into the road to follow him. And although his car is facing the opposite direction to you, he doesn't just drive off. He does a U-turn in the middle of the road to go the opposite direction. And this gives you the opportunity to see this man's face. The man drove off, and you, confused, go back inside and explain everything to your dad. Concerned, your dad already had the police called, and rather swiftly, the police were at the door taking a written statement. But it was only an hour later when the police called back to get even more information. And then a few hours later, at 6 in the morning, the police once again returned for more information. And the reason why the police returned at 6 in the morning was because only a mile and a half away from your home, there was another mysterious murder. And it happened only shortly after your initial report was made. And it was at that point when everything had clicked. Initially, you and your parents assumed that there must have been some sort of potential burglar lurking in the yard that was scared away when he saw that people were up. But once the police had confirmed that there was a murder only a mile from your home, they suspected that you didn't find a burglar, but that you likely came face to face with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1985, the police identified a vehicle that matched the description that you had given them. It was an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack parked on the side of the road. The police had this car towed and impounded, likely to provoke the owner to show up to reclaim it and then to be investigated. When the police towed this car, they asked you, is this the car that you saw that night? And you confirmed it. And the reason why they towed this car initially is because on the night when they took their official statement, you told them that you saw this exact car. And you even remembered the first few digits of the license plate. This alone was a huge breakthrough in the case, and was one of the major turning points that got Richard Ramirez caught. Once the vehicle was confirmed to be the one that they saw that night, police investigated the entire vehicle, finding very little evidence. That was until they found a single fingerprint on the driver's side mirror, a fingerprint that linked the driver of the vehicle to Richard Ramirez. And at that point, a photo and name was submitted to the public as a person of interest. And it was at that point when the floodgates on this case burst open. One day after the name and photo were submitted to the public, on August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez was trying to steal a vehicle. And while attempting to steal this vehicle, vehicle, an altercation broke out, and this altercation got the attention of neighbors. And although Ramirez was able to get car keys from a woman that he had just assaulted, before he could drive away with his vehicle he had attempted to steal, a neighbor had pulled Ramirez out of the vehicle, and other neighbors at this point had also approached the vehicle and began to beat and restrain Ramirez. The police were called, showed up, and arrested the man. And 1 week later, the police called you one final time to identify the person you saw that night in a lineup. You looked at 5 criminals standing beside each other, and you instantly recognized the man who you saw in your backyard. You tell the police that that was the man you saw that night, and it was your testimony that led to the Night Stalker being caught once and for all. The boy in the story that identified Ramirez is known as James Ramiro, and he is truly one brave young man. Not even a young man, he's like 13, he's literally a boy, like a child. And perhaps him being so naive allowed him to have the confidence and the blissful ignorance to follow a mysterious man into your backyard in the middle of the night. As a grown man, I wouldn't do that alone, even if I was armed. Regardless, James being up late that night and deciding to follow this man to the yard ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and undoubtedly saved the lives of innocent people that Richard Ramirez would have victimized next. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. His convictions specifically were 12 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of second-degree murder, and 14 counts of first-degree burglary. And although he was on death row, he died on June 7th, 2013, at the age of 53 of lymphoma. I think the story kind of tells itself here. James was an absolute legend of a boy, and Ramirez was a troubled excuse for a man. And although Ramirez was unfortunately able to victimize so many innocent people, justice was at least eventually served, largely in part to James. So exactly how did the Night Stalker get caught? Well, he messed with the wrong boy staying up past his bedtime. The year is 1998. You live in a small town in England known as Hyde, and you have recently been going through some distressing times with your family. Your father-in-law has been experiencing very odd medical symptoms, and it's believed that he may have cancer. Obviously, wanting the best, you and your family decide to go to one of the most respected and well-known doctors in the entire city of Hyde, a man named Harold Shipman. Your father-in-law gets an examination, and a few days later, you call him to follow up on the prognosis. The doctor on the phone rather firmly responds, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs," which was a harsh way of delivering news that someone was going to die soon. Almost eerie, as Easter was only 2 weeks away. Due to the shock of the news you've just received, you appreciate him telling you the truth, and you hang up the phone and begin talking to your family. Your family took this news a little bit softer, as they believed that he was being metaphorical and almost joking, saying that the end was soon, but there was no way that it could have been this soon, right? Regardless, your family started to make the appropriate plans. And almost on cue, only 4 days later after that phone call, even earlier than the doctor had claimed, your father-in-law had passed away. The truth behind his death was a lot more disturbing than simply him succumbing to the disease he had. You meet with the doctor after your father-in-law's passing to discuss if anything could have been done and what really happened and why this was so sudden. And the doctor, rather sternly yet calmly and somewhat compassionately, described to you that sometimes things happen so fast, and realistically in situations with terminal illness, there's not much you can do. This doctor tells you that an autopsy isn't required and that you should plan the funeral as soon as possible to begin the grieving process. And like many others before you, you take his advice and opt to not have an autopsy. This practice was common for Harold Shipman, as he not only advocated for all of his patients who had family members who passed away to not only not get an autopsy, but also to get a cremation as fast as possible. But as you likely already know, these recommendations weren't coming from a place of compassion, but instead out of a place of self-preservation. And the reason why I say this is because Harold Shipman was actively killing his patients. He targeted typically elderly women and sometimes elderly men too, and for the most part victimized people who were already terminally ill and unlikely to be suspected of accidental or intentional death. Harold was a troubled individual, there was no doubt about it. His mother passed away at a young age, and he struggled with drug abuse in his early career as a doctor and was even admitted to a facility. However, it wasn't put on his record and he was only given a warning. This allowed him to continue practicing and even to get his own private practice, which may sound like a fortunate second chance, although that optimism slips away when you realize what happened within his private practice. Harold was no longer addicted to heroin, but he was seemingly addicted to giving his target patients a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug that was given to his mother when she was dying. Harold Shipman was suspected of killing his victims as early as 1975, and it wasn't until 1998 when suspicions of foul play began to become overwhelming. As in small communities, word spreads quickly, and it was at that point when Harold Shipman was investigated. Upon investigation, it was confirmed that Harold Shipman's mortality rate as a doctor was 10 times above the average. Yet, when the health authority investigated all of the paperwork associated with these patients and their deaths, they found no irregularities, which at the time lowered towards suspicion. But as we know now, these papers were actually forged to fit the stories that he was spinning. And while the health authority was investigating the patients, the Greater Manchester Police were investigating Shipman, and unfortunately also failed, as they weren't even able to find his criminal history or the time he spent in an institution for his drug abuse. What this essentially means is that this first investigation into Harold Shipman almost cleared his name. It didn't clear suspicions, but legally speaking, Harold was doing nothing wrong. He was a standard doctor who unfortunately had some unlucky clients. But this story didn't last for long. Only a few months later, on June 24th, 1998, Harold made a very distinct choice that led directly to him being caught. Harold Shipman was at the home of one of his patients, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. This woman was 81 years old and described as being in great health. She had an appointment with Shipman at her home to have a routine blood test, although what she got instead was a lethal dose of diamorphine. As per his standard practice, he quickly wrote her death certificate and stated her cause of death as old age and suggested she be cremated immediately. But that wasn't the only document he forged. Somewhat unusually, he also forged a will, and it was Kathleen's will, giving all of her worldly possessions to her doctor, Harold Shipman. And it was this move specifically that raised more than a few red flags. Kathleen was a former mayor of Hyde, and for that reason was a notable person in the community, and her death was very upsetting to many, particularly her family, who were shocked not only that their healthy mother and grandmother passed away, but also that she'd left all of her money to her doctor. And with that, they began investigating Harold themselves, when they quickly realized that he was behind not only the forgery, but also the death. The family was able to confirm that Harold's fingerprints were on the will that he forged, and that the will was even typed on his typewriter that was missing a key, which undoubtedly confirmed that he was the one who wrote it. And this family somehow was able to find out about Harold's past when the police weren't able to, which at the very least is odd and borderline negligent by the police. Kathleen's family demanded that her body be autopsied, and it was during that autopsy when it was found that she had a lethal dose of diamorphine in her muscle tissue, and Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Once he was arrested, the family of 11 other victims who had their family member buried and not cremated opted to have their family members' bodies examined by the police. And these examinations also showed that these 11 other patients of Harold Shipman were also victims of his. And it was at this time that Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders from 1995 to 1998. Although in the investigations that followed his initial conviction, there was over 284 confirmed killings by Harold Shipman. And there are even more that are unconfirmed but likely possible. Just let that sink in. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but he was confirmed to have killed at least 284 of his patients, likely from the years of 1975 to 1998. Harold received life in prison, although only a few years into his sentence, he ended his own life on January 13th, 2004 at the age of 57. Shipman never gave any motive for his murders and never admitted to any of it. These are just 3 cases of how some of the most infamous serial killers were caught. And if you are interested in hearing more, unfortunately, there is more stories to tell. Unfortunate because these stories involve real victims, and I try to be as respectful as possible of that fact.